wind in the Dakota Territory did not simply blow, it hunted. It prowled across the endless, undulating seas of yellow grass, searching for any crack in a cabin wall or any gap in a coat collar. It carried the taste of dust and the metallic scent of coming snow, screaming over the flatlands with a voice that sounded like a living thing in pain. To the settlers who clung to the edge of the railroad tracks in the raw, unfinished town of Iron Creek, the wind was a constant reminder that they were intruders here. The land was vast, indifferent, and ready to swallow them whole if their vigilance wavered for even a single heartbeat. Clara Hayes stood in the center of her one-room schoolhouse, the walls vibrating slightly under the assault of a particularly violent gust. The air inside was thick with the smell of chalk dust and the burning wood in the cast-iron stove, but beneath that lay the sour, heavy odor of sickness. "Drink this, William," she said softly, holding a tin cup to the lips of the boy shivering on the bench she had converted into a makeshift cot. "It is willow bark tea. It will help the heat in your blood." The boy, no more than 8 years old, whimpered and turned his head away. His skin was flushed a dangerous crimson, dry like old parchment. Clara did not have the luxury of patience. She set her jaw, a line of stubbornness appearing around her mouth that had become a permanent feature of her face in the last 2 years. She slipped a hand behind the boy's neck, forcing him to sit up just enough to trickle the bitter liquid into his mouth. Supplies were dangerously low. The dark glass bottle of laudanum was empty, and the quinine powder had run out 3 weeks ago. The nearest doctor was a 3-day ride east, assuming the trails were not washed out or buried in drifts. Here, Clara was the doctor, the nurse, the teacher, and the priest. She was 28 years old, but when she caught her reflection in the dark window pane at night, she saw a woman who looked a decade older, her eyes shadowed by a fatigue that the sleep could no longer cure. She wiped William's forehead with a damp rag, her mind drifting involuntarily to Thomas. It was a treacherous habit, remembering. Thomas had died in a winter much like the one threatening to descend now. He had been a man of big dreams and soft hands, a clerk from Ohio who believed the government pamphlets about the abundance of the West. He had dragged Clara out here with promises of a homestead that would rival the great estates of the East. Instead, the West had broken him. It took his strength with the plow. It took his hope with the drought. And finally, it took his life with a fever that burned him out in 48 hours. Clara had buried him herself because the ground was freezing fast and there was no one else to hold the shovel. She remembered the sound of the frozen earth hitting the pine box, a hollow thud that echoed in her nightmares. She had not cried then. She had simply decided that she would never again rely on a man to save her. Survival was a solitary business. Clara checked the fire, adding a precious log to the embers. She could not let the room go cold. The boy's breathing was ragged, a sound like tearing paper. "Rest now," she whispered. "I will not leave you." She sat by the window, looking out at the gray horizon. Dust devils danced on the ridge, swirling columns of grit that rose and fell like ghosts. The town of Iron Creek lay a mile down the rutted road, a collection of unpainted timber buildings that looked as though they had been dropped from the sky by accident. There was the depot, the general store, the saloon, and the livery, all huddling together against the emptiness. It was a place of hard men and tired women, held together by the thin steel ribbon of the railroad and the cattle that were driven up from Texas. It was also a place of hate. Clara had seen the way the ranchers looked toward the north, where the treaty lines were drawn. She had heard the talk in the mercantile, the angry whispers about the Lakota, every missing cow, every brush fire, every mysterious noise in the night was laid at the feet of the people who had lived here long before the first rail was spiked. The fear was palpable, a living current that ran beneath the conversations about weather and grain prices. They hated the Lakota because they feared them, and they feared them because they knew, deep down, that the land was being stolen inch by inch. The door to the schoolhouse rattled, but it was only the wind. Clara rubbed her arms, feeling the chill settle into her bones. She had to go into town later. She needed kerosene and flour, and she had to see if the post had brought the distinctively stamped letter from the territorial governor regarding her teaching stipend. It was late by months. When William's mother finally arrived in a buckboard wagon, wrapped in wool blankets and looking terrified, Clara helped lift the boy into the back. "Keep him warm." "Martha," Clara instructed, her voice firm, "do not let the fire go out tonight. If the fever spikes, use cool cloths on his neck. God bless you, Mrs. Hayes," the woman said, her eyes wet. "I do not know what we would do without you." Clara watched them rattle away into the gray afternoon. She did not feel blessed. She felt hollowed out, a vessel comprised only of duty and grit. She tied her bonnet tight, wrapped her heavy woolen shawl around her shoulders, and locked the schoolhouse door. The walk to town was a battle against the elements. The wind whipped her skirts around her legs and stung her cheeks with grit. By the time she reached the main street of Iron Creek, her face was numb. The town was busy despite the weather. Cowboys from the Double R Ranch were hitching their horses in front of the saloon, their laughter loud and brittle. A group of soldiers from the nearby fort stood on the boardwalk, smoking tobacco and watching the street with bored, predatory eyes. Clara kept her head down, clutching her reticule. She moved toward the general store, eager for the warmth of the pot-bellied stove inside. As she stepped onto the wooden porch, the heavy door swung open, and a man stepped out, nearly colliding with her. He was not a settler. He was tall, with broad shoulders that filled the frame of the doorway. He wore a worn, blue Army-issue coat that was too tight across the chest, the brass buttons tarnished and dull. Beneath it, he wore buckskin leggings and moccasins that made no sound on the wood. His hair was long, black as a raven's wing, and braided neatly on either side of a face that seemed carved from granite. Clara stopped, her breath catching in her throat. She had seen Lakota men before, usually at a distance, riding along the ridges or trading silently at the edge of the fort, but she had never been this close to one. He looked down at her. His eyes were dark, intelligent, and guarded. There was no subservience in his posture, none of the shuffling defeat she saw in the older natives who begged for food near the depot. This man stood with a quiet, terrifying dignity. He held a small sack of cornmeal in one hand. "Excuse me," Clara murmured, stepping aside. He did not move immediately. For a second, his gaze held hers. Clara felt a strange, electric shock run through her, a sensation so sudden and sharp it was almost physical. It was not fear. It was something deeper, a recognition she could not name. It was as if the wind had suddenly stopped and the world had gone silent. Then he nodded, a barely perceptible dip of his chin. "Excuse me, ma'am?" he said. His voice was deep, the English heavily accented but clear. He stepped past her, moving with a fluid grace that made the heavy-booted men around them look clumsy. Clara turned to watch him go. He walked toward 3 other Lakota men who were waiting by the water trough, their horses thin and nervous. Clara forced herself to turn away and enter the store. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. She was a widow, a school teacher, a woman of reputation. She had no business staring at a savage. The word tasted sour in her mind as soon as she thought it. Savage. That was what the town called them. But the man in the army coat had not looked like a savage. He had looked like a king in exile. The general store was warm and smelled of coffee beans, leather, and sawdust. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, was weighing sugar for Mrs. Gable, the banker's wife. "Did you see them, Mrs.?" Gable was saying, her voice pitched high with indignation. "Walking right down the main street as if they own the place. It is a disgrace that the colonel allows them off the reservation." "They are here to talk about the beef rations," Henderson said, wiping his hands on his apron. "The delegation claims the government promised 50 head of cattle last month and delivered only 10. They should be grateful for the 10. Mrs. Gable sniffed. "They do nothing but beg and steal. My husband says they are a blight on the territory." Clara moved to the back of the store, feigning interest in a bolt of calico fabric. She felt a flush of heat rise up her neck. She remembered the man's eyes. There had been anger there. Yes, but it was buried deep beneath a layer of iron control. He knew what these people thought of him. He heard the whispers. Clara selected her flour and a tin of kerosene. She placed them on the counter as misses. Gable left, the bell above the door jingling cheerfully. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Hayes," Henderson said. He looked tired. "It is going to be a bad night. The barometer is dropping like a stone. I hope the snow holds off," Clara said. "I have to walk back to the schoolhouse." Henderson frowned. "You should stay in town. The hotel has rooms. I have work to do," Clara said. "And I cannot afford the hotel," as she counted out the coins. 70 cents for the flour, 40 for the kerosene. A shout erupted from the street outside. It was followed by the crash of something breaking and the high, terrified whinny of a horse. Clara and Henderson exchanged a look. Without a word, they hurried to the window. Outside, a crowd was gathering in front of the saloon. In the center of the muddy street, a burly ranch hand named Bates was shoving one of the older Lakota men. Bates was known in Iron Creek for two things: his capacity for whiskey and his vicious temper. He was swaying on his feet, his face purple with rage. "You thieving red devil!" Bates roared, his voice slurring. "I saw you. You were eyeing my mare, thinking about cutting her loose. Were you?" The older Lakota man held his hands up, palms open, shaking his head. He spoke rapidly in his own tongue, looking around for help. Bates shoved him again, harder this time. The old man stumbled back, tripping over his own feet and falling into the mud. The crowd laughed. It was a cruel, ugly sound. "Speak English," Bates shouted, "or are you too stupid to learn?" Suddenly, the tall man from the store cut through the crowd. He moved fast. He stepped between Bates and the fallen elder, his posture shifting from calm to lethal in a fraction of a second. He did not touch Bates, but he stood so close that the ranch hand flinched backward. "He did not touch your horse," the tall man said. His voice carried over the wind. "We are leaving. Stand aside." Bates blinked, surprised by the English and the defiance. He looked at the crowd, sensing he had an audience to perform for. He sneered, his hand dropping to the heavy Colt revolver at his hip. "You calling me a liar, boy?" Bates spat. "I say he was stealing. And in this town, we hang horse thieves." The air in the street seemed to freeze. The soldiers on the boardwalk straightened up but made no move to interfere. They were content to watch the show. Clara pushed open the door of the store and stepped out onto the porch. She did not know why she did it. Every instinct she had screamed at her to stay inside, to stay safe, to look away. But the sight of the old man in the mud and the bully towering over him ignited a spark of fury in her chest that she could not suppress. "I said stand aside," the Lakota man repeated. "We want no trouble. You brought the trouble when you rode in here." Bates snarled. He drew his gun. The metal glinted dull gray in the overcast light. "Stop it." The voice was clear and sharp. It took a moment for Clara to realize it was her own. The crowd turned. Bates looked up, his eyes narrowing. Clara Hayes stood on the edge of the boardwalk, clutching her shawl with white-knuckled hands. She felt exposed, ridiculous, and terrified, but she did not step back. "What did you say, teacher?" Bates asked, a dangerous grin spreading across his face. "I said stop it," Clara said, her voice trembling slightly before she steadied it. "That man did not steal your horse. And how would you know?" Bates challenged. "Because," Clara lied, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "He was with me." Silence descended on the street. It was heavy and absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The Lakota man, Chaska, though she did not yet know his name, turned to look at her. His expression was one of profound shock. "With you?" Bates laughed, a harsh bark of sound. "You expect us to believe you were socializing with a buck?" "He was at the schoolhouse," Clara said, forcing the words out. She lifted her chin. "He was moving wood for the stove. I asked him to. He was there until 10 minutes ago. He could not have been near your horse. It was a clumsy lie. Anyone with a mind to check the timeline would know it was impossible." But Clara Hayes was the widow of a respected man, and she was the town schoolteacher. Her word carried a weight that Bates's drunken accusations did not. Bates looked from Clara to the Lakota man and back again. He lowered the gun slowly, his face twisting in disgust. "Well, ain't that something?" he sneered. "The widow Hayes, entertaining guests. I guess we know where your sympathies lie. Lady." He holstered the gun and spat on the ground near the tall man's boots. "Get out of here," Bates muttered, "before I change my mind." The tall Lakota man did not look at Bates. He looked at Clara. For a long moment, across the muddy expanse of the street, they were the only two people in the world. His eyes were searching hers, trying to understand why she had done this, why she had thrown her reputation into the mud to save a stranger. Then he turned, helped the older man to his feet, and spoke a sharp command in his own language. The delegation mounted their horses. As they rode past the general store, the tall man looked at Clara one last time. He gave a single, solemn nod. It was not a smile, but it was an acknowledgement, a debt recorded. Then they were gone, riding out toward the open prairie. Clara was left standing on the boardwalk, shivering uncontrollably. The crowd began to disperse, but the looks they cast her were no longer indifferent. They were cold, suspicious. "Mrs." Gable walked past her without a word, pulling her skirts aside as if Clara were contagious. "You should not have done that. Mrs. Hayes," Henderson said quietly from the doorway. "You have made enemies today." Clara picked up her flour and kerosene. "I could not watch him be shot for nothing," she said. "It was not for nothing." Henderson said, "It was for being Lakota. In this town, that is crime enough." Clara walked home with her head high, but inside, she was crumbling. She felt the eyes of the town on her back, burning like brands. She had crossed a line. She had taken the side of the enemy. By the time she reached the schoolhouse, the sky had turned a bruised purple. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees in the span of an hour. The storm that had been threatening all day finally broke with the violence of a dam bursting. The wind howled like a wounded animal, tearing at the shingles of the roof. Snow did not fall. It was driven sideways, a wall of white that erased the world. Clara barred the door and shoved rags into the cracks of the window frames. She lit the kerosene lamp, the small flame flickering in the draft. She made herself a cup of tea, her hands shaking so badly the cup rattled against the saucer. She sat by the stove, listening to the screaming darkness outside. She thought of the tall man. Where was he? Was he out in this? The thought made her stomach twist. Hours passed. The storm intensified. The cabin groaned under the weight of the wind. Clara dozed in her chair, wrapped in a quilt, her dreams fragmented and anxious. She woke to a sound that was not the wind. It was a frantic, rhythmic banging on the door. Clara sat up, her heart leaping into her throat. Who would be out in this? Travelers died in storms like this, wandering in circles until the cold stopped their hearts. The banging came again, desperate and heavy. "Help!" a voice cried out. It was muffled by the wood and the wind, high-pitched and female. "Please, help!" Clara grabbed the lantern and the heavy iron poker from the fireplace. She moved to the door, hesitating. It could be a trick. It could be Bates, drunk and looking for revenge. But the voice cried out again, a sound of pure anguish. Clara lifted the bar and pulled the door open. The wind slammed into her, nearly extinguishing the lantern. Snow swirled into the room. Standing on the step was a figure wrapped in a buffalo robe, crusted with ice. It was a woman. Her face was blue with cold, her eyes wide with terror. She was Lakota. "Please," the woman gasped, her English broken and thick. "My boy, Snake, he is burning. A snake bite? In this weather?" It seemed impossible, but the prairie was full of strange cruelties. Perhaps a rattler had sought the warmth of a lodge or a blanket and had struck when disturbed. "He die," the woman sobbed, grabbing Clara's sleeve. "You medicine woman. I see you fix boy at school. Please." Clara looked out into the white void. To go out there was madness. She could freeze. She could get lost. And if the town found out she was visiting a Lakota camp in the middle of the night, after what happened today, she would be ruined completely. They would drive her out. She looked at the woman's face. She saw the same desperation she had felt when Thomas was dying. The universal, frantic bargaining with God to spare someone you loved. Clara did not think. She acted. "Wait here," she shouted over the wind. She ran to her cupboard. She grabbed her medical bag, a worn leather satchel containing her limited supplies, a lancet, bandages, a small bottle of ammonia, dried echinacea root, and a jar of drawing salve. She pulled on her heavy coat, wrapped her thickest scarf around her face, and pulled on her oversized mittens. "Led the way," Clara said. The trek to the camp was a nightmare. The woman, whose name Clara did not know, held Clara's hand, pulling her through the drifts. The snow was knee-deep in places. The cold was a physical weight, pressing against Clara's chest, freezing the moisture in her nose. They walked for what felt like miles, though it was likely less than one. Clara kept her head down, focusing on the woman's moccasins breaking the snow in front of her. Finally, shapes emerged from the swirling white, cone-shaped lodges, huddled together in a grove of cottonwood trees near the river. The camp was small, perhaps 5 or 6 tipis. The dogs did not even bark. They were curled in balls under the wagons, buried in snow. The woman led Clara to a lodge near the center. She pushed aside the heavy buffalo hide flap and ushered Clara inside. The sudden warmth and smoke made Clara cough. The teepee was dimly lit by a small fire in the center. The air smelled of sage, wood smoke, and sickness. On a pile of furs at the back lay a small boy, no more than 5 years old. He was thrashing, his skin glistening with sweat despite the bitter cold outside. An older woman sat beside him, chanting softly. She looked up as Clara entered, her eyes narrowing in suspicion. The younger woman, the mother, spoke rapidly in Lakota, gesturing to Clara and the bag. The older woman fell silent, moving aside reluctantly. Clara knelt beside the boy. She unwrapped his leg. The bite was on the calf, 2 angry puncture wounds. The surrounding flesh swollen tight and purple. It was bad. The venom had been in him for hours. She opened her bag. Her hands were clumsy with cold, and she had to rub them together over the fire to get the feeling back. "I need hot water," Clara said, "and clean cloth." She worked through the night. The storm raged outside, shaking the canvas walls of the lodge. But inside, Clara was in her element. She lanced the wound to drain the infection, though she knew sucking the venom out was useless at this stage. She made a poultice of the echinacea and the drawing salve, binding it tight to the leg. She bathed the boy's burning forehead with snow the mother brought in a wooden bowl. She fought the fever with everything she had. She forced fluids down the boy's throat drop by drop. She watched his chest rise and fall, counting the breaths. The mother watched her every move, eyes wide and fearful. They did not speak the same language, but in the dim light of the dying fire, they spoke the language of mothers and healers. When the boy whimpered, Clara shushed him softly. When he shivered, she added her own shawl to his coverings. Hours bled into one another. Clara's back ached. Her eyes burned from the smoke, but she did not stop. Just before dawn, the wind died. The silence that followed was deafening. Clara touched the boy's forehead. It was cool and damp. The fever had broken. His breathing was deep and rhythmic. "He will live," Clara whispered. She looked at the mother and nodded. "He will sleep now." The mother collapsed forward, burying her face in her hands, weeping silently. She reached out and took Clara's hand, pressing it to her forehead. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you." Clara stood up. Her legs were stiff. She felt lightheaded with exhaustion. She needed fresh air. "I must go," Clara said, "before the town wakes." She packed her bag and stepped out of the lodge. The world had been transformed. The storm had left the plains covered in a pristine, blinding sheet of white. The sky to the east was bleeding pink and gold, the sun just beginning to crest the horizon. The air was still and bitterly cold. Clara took a step, her boot slipping on a patch of ice hidden beneath the fresh snow. Her legs, weak from the long night of kneeling, gave way. She pitched forward, bracing herself for the hard impact. It never came. Strong hands gripped her arms, stopping her fall. The grip was firm, unyielding, yet surprisingly gentle. Clara gasped, looking up. He was standing there. The tall man from the general store. He was wrapped in a heavy blanket, his hair loose around his shoulders. He looked down at her, his dark eyes wide with disbelief. He looked from her face to the lodge she had just exited, and then back to her. He saw the fatigue etched into her features, the medical bag clutched in her hand. "You," he said. His voice was rough with sleep and shock. Clara regained her balance, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was standing in the middle of a Lakota camp, at dawn, held in the arms of the man she had lied to save. "You are the woman from the town," he said, and it was not a question. "You were in my sister's lodge?" Clara nodded, pulling her arms gently from his grasp. She stepped back, wrapping her coat tighter around herself. "Her son was sick," Clara said, her voice shaking in the cold air. "She came for me." "You saved him?" Chaska asked. "I did what I could," Clara said. "The fever has broken." Chaska stared at her. He looked at the white woman who stood shivering in the snow, the woman who had faced down a gunman for him yesterday, and who had walked through a blizzard to save his nephew tonight. The hostility she had seen in the town was nowhere in his face now. There was only a profound, bewildered wonder. "Why?" he asked softly. "Why would you do this?" Clara looked at him. The sun crested the horizon, setting the snow on fire with light. "Because he is a child," she said simply. "And I'm a nurse." She turned to go, but she felt his hand touch her elbow. A light touch, barely there, but it stopped her in her tracks. "Wait," Chaska said. "The snow is deep. You cannot walk back alone." Clara looked back at him. The golden light caught the sharp angles of his face. "I will take you," he said. And in the silence of the winter morning, with the world white and new around them, Clara knew that her life had just changed irrevocably. She had walked into the storm to save a child, but standing there looking into his dark eyes, she wondered if she was the one who was about to be saved. The morning sun did not bring warmth. It brought only a ruthless, illuminating clarity. As the gray light washed over the snow-covered plains, the Lakota camp was revealed not as a place of mystic shadow, as it had seemed in the storm, but as a collection of stark, desperate realities. Clara stood by the dying fire outside the lodge, her breath pluming in the frigid air. In the daylight, the poverty of the camp was impossible to ignore. The horses tethered near the river were rib-sprung and gaunt, pawing listlessly at the frozen ground for grass that was not there. The tipis were patched with mismatched scraps of canvas and hide, offering only thin protection against a wind that could freeze a man's blood in minutes. Old men sat wrapped in threadbare army blankets, their faces weathered into maps of deep gullies and ridges, watching her with eyes that held no hostility, only a profound, exhausted wariness. Children, too quiet for the morning, huddled together for warmth, their small limbs sticking out from coverings that were far too thin for a Dakota winter. This was not a war party. This was a remnant. It was a people being squeezed by an invisible hand, pushed onto land that shrank with every passing season, waiting for rations that the government agents promised but rarely delivered. Clara felt a flush of shame burn through her, hotter than the fire. She was a part of the world that had done this. She taught from books that spoke of manifest destiny and the march of civilization. But here, civilization looked like starvation. A movement to her right made her turn. The tall man, Chaska, stepped out of his sister's lodge. He had shed the blanket and wore his worn blue coat again, buttoned to the chin against the cold. He looked at the camp, his expression unreadable. Before turning his gaze to her, he approached her slowly, his boots crunching softly on the snow. He stopped a respectable distance away, removing his hat. "Wopila tanka," he said. The words were low and resonant. Clara looked at him, uncertain. "It means big thanks," Chaska translated. his English formal and precise, as if he were choosing each word from a limited, precious supply. "You saved him. My nephew." Clara looked back at the lodge where the boy slept. "Your nephew?" she asked. "Yes," Chaska said. "The woman is Winona. My sister. Her husband was killed 2 winters ago. The boy is all she has." Clara felt the weight of the night's shift and settle onto her shoulders. She had not just saved a random child. She had saved the kin of the man who had intervened for her in town. The threads of their lives were knotting together in ways she had not anticipated. "I am glad I could help," Clara said, her voice raspy from the smoke and lack of sleep. The venom was deep, but he is strong. He needs rest and food. "Food," Chaska repeated. The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. He looked away, toward the gaunt horses. "We will do what we can." As they stood there, an elder walked past, leaning heavily on a willow staff. He stopped and looked at Clara. His gaze was sharp, dissecting. He said something to Chaska in Lakota, his tone harsh and biting. Chaska replied calmly, but firmly. The old man spat on the ground near Clara's boots, not quite at her, but close enough to send a message, and walked on. "Do not mind him," Chaska said quietly. Though his jaw was tight, he remembers the time before the forts. He sees a white woman, and he sees the end of things. "I understand," Clara said. Though the hostility stung, she pulled her shawl tighter. "I should go. The town will be waking up." Chaska looked at the horizon. The sky was a pale, hard blue, and the wind was picking up again, whipping the loose snow into stinging clouds. "You cannot walk," he said. "The drifts are deep in the hollows. The wind is turning. It will cover your tracks and you will lose the road." "I walked here," Clara countered, though the thought of trudging back through the knee-deep snow made her legs tremble. "You walked with the storm at your back," Chaska said. "Now you face it. I will take you." It was not an offer. It was a statement of fact. Clara looked at him, about to argue, about to mention propriety and what people would say, but then she looked at the endless expanse of white between here and Iron Creek. She was exhausted, hungry, and cold. Pride would not keep her warm, and it certainly would not keep her alive. "Thank you," she said stiffly. Chaska nodded. He went to the line of horses and untied a spotted mare that looked slightly sturdier than the others. He threw a blanket over its back. He had no saddle and led it to her. He mounted first, swinging up with an easy grace, and then reached a hand down to her. Clara hesitated for only a second before taking it. His grip was iron hard, pulling her up behind him. "Hold on to the waist," he instructed. Clara wrapped her arms tentatively around his midsection, feeling the rough wool of the army coat and the solid warmth of the man beneath it. It was improper. It was scandalous. If Mrs. Gable or the Reverend could see her now, pressed against a Lakota warrior on a saddleless horse, they would likely faint. But as Chaska urged the horse forward and they moved out of the shelter of the trees, the wind hit them with the force of a physical blow, and Clara forgot about propriety. She buried her face in the back of his coat, clinging to him not out of affection, but out of a desperate need for anchor in a world that was trying to blow her away. The ride back was a blur of white and cold. The horse plodded through the drifts, its breath steaming in rhythm with its steps. The silence of the prairie was vast, broken only by the wind and the crunch of hooves. After a mile, the wind died down slightly, allowing them to speak without shouting. "You have a name?" Chaska asked, not turning his head. "Clara," she said against his coat. "Clara Hayes. Clara." He tested the sound of it. "I am Chaska. I know," she said. "I heard your sister say it." They rode in silence for another few minutes. The town of Iron Creek was still hidden behind the rise of the land. "Why do you live alone?" "Clara Hayes?" Chaska asked. "It is hard for a woman alone in this country." "I am a widow," Clara answered. "My husband died last winter." "I'm sorry," Chaska said. "The fever?" "Yes," Clara said, "and stubbornness. He wanted to farm land that did not want to be farmed. We came west for a new life. We found this. The land does not care what we want," Chaska said. "The land only is We must learn to live with it, or it breaks us. Is that why you work for the army? Clara asked, the question slipping out before she could check it. You interpret for the soldiers. She felt his back stiffen slightly. I work for my people, Chaska said, his voice hard. The soldiers speak with forked tongues. They say one thing and write another on the paper. If I am not there to tell the chiefs what the paper really says, they will sign away the sky and the water and think they are trading for blankets. But they hate you for it, Clara said softly. Both sides. The soldiers do not trust you, and your people. My people know I walk in two worlds so they can live in one, Chaska said. It is a lonely path, but someone must walk it. Clara tightened her grip on his coat. She understood loneliness. She understood the burden of doing what was necessary, even when it scraped you raw. I never wanted to be a teacher, she admitted, her voice barely audible over the wind. I wanted to be a mother, but Thomas died, and the money ran out, and the town needed someone to teach the children to read. So I stayed. I stayed because I had nowhere else to go. We are both caught in traps we did not set, Chaska said. The intimacy of the confession hung between them, suspended in the cold air. They were two outcasts sharing a horse in the middle of a frozen ocean, bound by a strange, fragile understanding. As the buildings of Iron Creek came into view, gray smudges against the white snow, the reality of the world returned. Chaska slowed the horse. We must stop here, he said, pulling up near a cluster of scrub oak a quarter mile from the first house. If we ride in together, they will say things, bad things, about you. Clara slid down from the horse. Her legs were numb, and she stumbled slightly upon hitting the ground. Chaska remained mounted, looking down at her. You are a brave woman, Clara Hayes, he said. And you are a good man, Chaska, she replied, looking up at him. No matter what they say. He held her gaze for a long moment, his dark eyes intense. Then he turned the horse and kicked it into a gallop, disappearing back into the whiteness from which they had come. Clara brushed the snow from her skirt and began the long walk into town. She thought she was unobserved, but as she passed the perimeter fence of the Miller Ranch, she saw a curtain twitch in the main house. Mrs. Miller's face appeared, pale and sharp behind the glass. Clara kept walking, her chin high, but she felt the gaze like a physical touch, slimy and cold. The seeds had been planted. The retribution was quiet, cowardly, and inevitable. 3 days later, Clara arrived at the schoolhouse to find the morning sun streaming through a jagged hole in the front window. A rock, the size of a man's fist, lay in the center of the room amidst a spray of shattered glass. Clara stood in the doorway, her hand gripping the latch. The cold air poured into the room, chilling it, but it was not the broken window that made her stomach turn. It was the writing on the whitewashed wall behind her desk. Someone had taken a piece of charcoal and scrawled a single, hateful slur in crude, jagged letters, Indian lover. Clara stared at the words. She felt a rush of blood to her face, a mix of humiliation and a white-hot anger that made her hands shake. They did not have the courage to say it to her face. They waited until night, until the darkness hid them, to strike at a woman who spent her days teaching their children to read the Bible. She dropped her books and marched to the bucket of water in the corner. She grabbed a rag and the bar of lye soap. She scrubbed the wall with a ferocity that tore the skin of her knuckles. She scrubbed until the charcoal was gone, until the whitewash was gray and the wood beneath was raw. She scrubbed until she was panting, tears of rage pricking her eyes. She would not tell anyone. If she went to the sheriff, he would shrug. If she went to the reverend, he would tell her to be more careful with her associations. They would tell her she brought this on herself. They would tell her to stay in her place. So she swept the glass, nailed a piece of oilcloth over the broken pane, and rang the bell for school to begin. When the children filed in, William among them, looking pale but healthy, she smiled at them. She taught them their sums and their letters. But every time she looked at the oilcloth flapping in the wind, her heart hardened a little more. Later that afternoon, Chaska rode past the schoolhouse. He was on his way to the fort, dressed in his army coat. He did not stop, but he slowed his horse. His sharp eyes caught the oilcloth over the window. He saw the faint, scrubbed-out shadow on the wall through the open door. He looked at Clara, who was standing on the step, watching the children leave. He did not wave. He did not speak, but his jaw set in a grim line, and his eyes darkened. He understood. She was paying the price for the life of his nephew. The debt he owed her had just grown heavier. The winter ground on, relentless and cruel. The snow piled high against the buildings, turning the streets into tunnels, and with the deep cold came the sickness. It started at the fort. A recruit from the east brought it with him. The fever, the headache, the terrifying rash, smallpox. The word was whispered with dread in the mercantile and the saloon. It was the specter that haunted the frontier, a killer that did not care about treaties or property lines. The fort commander, Colonel Bragg, declared a quarantine, but the post surgeon was drunk half the time, and the infirmary was overwhelmed within days. They needed hands. They needed anyone who knew how to bind a wound or cool a fever. A soldier came to the schoolhouse on a Tuesday morning. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, twisting his hat in his hands, "the colonel requests your presence. We have men down, and the surgeon cannot manage. We heard you have a knack for nursing." Clara did not hesitate. She dismissed the children, telling them to go straight home and stay there. She packed her small bag and followed the soldier to the fort. The infirmary was a long, low building made of rough-hewn logs. The air inside was stifling, thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, carbolic acid, and the metallic tang of blood. Cots were lined up almost touching one another. It was not just soldiers. In the back corner, separated by a thin curtain, were 4 Lakota men, prisoners who had been brought in for questioning about cattle theft and had fallen ill while in the stockade. Clara set to work immediately. She washed faces, changed soiled linens, and spooned broth into mouths that were too weak to open. She worked with a mechanical efficiency, shutting off the part of her mind that wanted to recoil from the suffering. She was not the only one working. Chaska was there. The army did not trust him to fight, but they were happy to use him to translate the groans of the dying prisoners and to haul water and wood. He moved through the crowded room with silent strength, lifting men who were too heavy for Clara, holding them down when the delirium took them. They worked in a rhythm, side by side. They did not speak much. There was no time, but they moved around each other like a single entity. When Clara reached for a basin, Chaska was there to hand it to her. When Chaska needed a fresh bandage, Clara had it ready before he asked. The heat in the room was oppressive. The pot-bellied stove was glowing red in the corner, and the sheer number of bodies made the air heavy and wet. Clara was moving between the cots, carrying a basin of water. Her foot caught a slick patch on the floorboards. Spilled water, or perhaps something worse. Her boots lost their purchase. She flailed, the basin tipping, ready to crash to the floor. A strong arm wrapped around her waist, arresting her fall instantly. She gasped, dropping the basin with a clang that was lost in the general din of the room. She was pressed hard against a solid chest. She looked up. Chaska had caught her. His arm was a band of iron around her waist, pulling her tight against him to keep her upright. For a second, the world narrowed down to the point of contact. She could feel the heat of his body through his shirt. She could smell the wood smoke and sage that seemed to cling to his skin, cutting through the hospital reek. "Careful," he murmured, his face inches from hers. "The floor is treacherous." Clara's hands were resting on his chest. Her fingers splayed against the rough wool of his shirt. She could feel the slow, steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. She looked into his eyes and saw a flash of something raw and unguarded, a hunger that mirrored the sudden, twisting lurch in her own stomach. They stood there for a heartbeat too long. A soldier on a nearby cot groaned, and the spell broke. Clara pulled back, breathless, her face flaming. She smoothed her apron, refusing to look at the other soldiers to see if they had noticed. "Thank you," she whispered. Chaska nodded, his face returning to its impassive mask, but his eyes lingered on her for a second before he turned back to his work. 2 hours later, the chaos had subsided slightly. The worst cases were sedated or sleeping. Clara retreated to the small supply room at the back of the infirmary to prepare more bandages. It was a cramped space, filled with crates and barrels, used as a secondary treatment area for overflow. She was tearing strips of muslin from a bolt of cloth. She was tired, her movements clumsy. She leaned against a sturdy oak table to steady herself as she ripped the fabric. A sharp, searing pain shot up her thigh. Clara cried out, stumbling back. She looked down. A jagged, splintered piece of wood jutting from the rough-hewn leg of the table had caught her skirt and the flesh beneath it. It had torn through the fabric and sliced deep into the soft skin of her outer thigh. She hissed in pain, lifting her skirt slightly. The blood was already welling up, dark and fast, soaking the white muslin of her petticoats. It was a deep gash, ugly and jagged. "Mrs. Hayes?" Chaska stood in the doorway. He had heard her cry. He took in the scene in an instant, Clara gripping the table, her face pale, the blood beginning to bloom on her skirt. He was at her side in 2 strides. "Let me see," he said. "It is nothing," Clara said quickly, trying to pull her skirt down. "Just a scratch. I can tend to it. It is bleeding through the wool." "Clara," Chaska said, his voice dropping the formality. "It needs to be cleaned and stitched, if the infection takes it in this place." He did not finish the sentence. They both knew the risks. Gangrene, blood poisoning. In a room full of sickness, an open wound was a death sentence. "I can do it myself," Clara insisted, though her hands were shaking. "You cannot reach it to stitch it properly," Chaska said. He looked around the small room. He kicked the doors shut with his heel, closing them off from the main ward. "Sit on the table," he commanded. Clara looked at him. His face was set in stone, professional and determined, but his eyes were burning. "Chaska," she began. "Sit," he repeated. He gripped her waist again, his hands large and warm. He lifted her effortlessly, hoisting her onto the edge of the heavy oak table. Clara gripped the edges of the wood, her knuckles white. She felt utterly exposed. Chaska moved between her knees. The position was so intimate, so flagrantly improper, that Clara felt dizzy. He reached for the basin of clean water and the bottle of carbolic acid on the shelf. He threaded a needle with steady hands. Then he looked at her. "I must see the wound," he said quietly. Clara nodded, her throat tight. She gripped the fabric of her skirt. "Don't move," he said. His voice was low, a rumble in his chest that she felt in her own bones. He reached out. His hands were gentle, respectful, but firm. He lifted the heavy wool of her skirt, pushing up the layers of petticoats until the white skin of her thigh was exposed. The air in the small room seemed to vanish. The silence was heavy, charged with the electricity of a storm about to break. Chaska stared at the wound, but Clara saw his eyes flick briefly to the curve of her leg, the pale skin contrasting with his dark hands. His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. He was a man, and she was a woman. And in this small, enclosed space, the laws of the territory meant nothing. He dipped a cloth in the water and acid. "This will burn." He pressed the cloth to the cut. Clara gasped, her back arching, her hands gripping his shoulders instinctively to brace herself against the pain. "Easy," he murmured. "Easy." He cleaned the blood away. His fingers grazed her skin, rough calluses against velvet softness. Every touch sent a jolt through Clara that had nothing to do with pain. It was a fire, starting in her belly and spreading to her fingertips. She looked down at his bent head, the glossy black braids, the strong line of his neck. She had never been this close to a man since Thomas, and even with Thomas, it had never felt like this dangerous, consuming heat. Chaska began to stitch. He worked quickly, his concentration absolute, but Clara could hear his breathing. It was ragged, controlled with effort. He was affecting her, she knew, but she was affecting him too. He was touching a white woman, a forbidden creature, and doing it with a tenderness that defied everything his world told him about hers. Clara watched him. She felt vulnerable, her legs parting for him to work, her skirt hiked up, her blood on his hands. But she did not feel afraid. She felt safe, paradoxically, impossibly safe. She sensed that this man would kill to protect her. "Done," Chaska whispered. He tied off the thread and snipped it with a small knife. He took a clean bandage and wrapped it around her thigh, his hands lingering for a fraction of a second too long on the warmth of her leg. He smoothed her skirt back down, covering her. He stepped back abruptly, as if the proximity had suddenly become physically painful. He turned away, washing his hands in the basin with violent, scrubbing motions. Clara sat on the table, trembling. The pain in her leg was a dull throb now, overshadowed by the pounding of her heart. Chaska turned back to face her. His chest was heaving slightly. His eyes met hers, and the mask was gone entirely. There was no translator, no schoolteacher, just a man and a woman in a room that felt too small to contain what had just happened. They stared at each other, the air crackling between them. They both knew that something fundamental had shifted. A line had been crossed, not on a map, but in the blood. They could not acknowledge it. To speak of it would be to give it power, and to give it power would be to invite destruction. In this world, a love like this was not a romance. It was a death warrant. "You should rest," Chaska said, his voice hoarse. Clara slid off the table, her leg held. She stood before him, looking up into his face. "Thank you, Chaska," she said. He did not reply. He simply looked at her, memorizing her face, before he turned and opened the door, letting the noise and the smell of the infirmary rush back in, drowning out the silence of what they almost said. Spring in the Dakota Territory did not arrive with the gentle unfolding of flowers or the soft warble of songbirds. It arrived like a brawler, violent and messy, tearing the white shroud of winter away to reveal a world of sucking mud and swollen, roaring rivers. The snowmelt cascaded down from the distant black hills, turning dry gulches into torrents that could sweep a wagon away in the blink of an eye. The earth, frozen hard as iron for months, softened into a mire that pulled boots from feet and trapped wagon wheels to the axles. Clara Hayes waged a daily war against this thaw in the small patch of ground behind her schoolhouse. She had planted early peas and radishes, optimistic foolishness born of a few days of sunshine. But the weather had turned on her. A sudden, vicious cold snap had crystallized the dew on the tender green shoots, turning them black and brittle. Clara knelt in the mud, her skirts gathered up and pinned, heedless of the damp seeping through the heavy fabric at her knees. She was trying to cover the remaining seedlings with straw and burlap, her hands red and stiff with cold. It was a small thing, a vegetable patch, but to Clara, it was a battle line. If she could make something grow in this hostile earth, if she could coax life out of the mud, then perhaps she belonged here. Perhaps she was not just a ghost haunting her own life, waiting for the wind to blow her away like it had Thomas. She packed the straw tight around a struggling pea vine. "You will live," she whispered fiercely to the plant. "You have no choice." The sound of a horse splashing through the muck on the road made her look up. It was Mrs. Miller, the rancher's wife, riding in a buckboard wagon driven by her sullen son. Mrs. Miller's face, framed by a severe bonnet, turned toward Clara. There was no wave, no nod of neighborly recognition. Instead, Mrs. Miller's eyes narrowed, her mouth thinning into a line of disapproval so sharp it could have cut glass. She stared at Clara for a long moment, then deliberately turned her head away, staring rigidly ahead as the wagon lurched toward town. Clara sat back on her heels, wiping a smear of mud from her cheek. The coldness of the interaction stung worse than the wind. It had been happening more often lately. Silence where there used to be greetings. A sudden hush falling over the general store when she entered. The town of Iron Creek was small, and boredom was a fertile soil for gossip. They had seen things. They had seen Chaska walking her to the perimeter of the fort after her shifts at the infirmary. They had seen her cutting across the open prairie toward the Lakota encampment instead of sticking to the main road. Small moments, innocent in their intent but damning in their appearance, had been stitched together into a tapestry of scandal. Clara stood up, brushing the dirt from her apron. She would not let them shame her. She had saved a child. She had nursed the sick. She had done nothing wrong. But as she walked back into the schoolhouse, the emptiness of the room felt louder than usual. 2 days later, the isolation took a formal shape. Reverend Caldwell knocked on the schoolhouse door just as Clara was sweeping out the dust of the day. He was a tall, gaunt man with eyes that always seemed to be counting sins. He held his hat in his hands, his knuckles bony and white. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice smooth and dry like old paper. "May I have a moment of your time?" "Of course, Reverend," Clara said, leaning the broom against the wall. "Please, come in. I can put the kettle on. No tea, thank you." The Reverend said he did not sit. He stood by the teacher's desk, running a finger along the spine of a primer. "I am here on a matter of concern for the flock." Clara folded her hands in front of her. "I am listening." "It has come to the attention of the church elders," he began, choosing his words with surgical care, "that you have been spending a significant amount of time in the company of the natives, specifically one of the men who works for the army." Clara kept her chin high. "You mean Chaska? He is the translator for the fort. We worked together during the smallpox outbreak, as you know." "Yes, the outbreak," Caldwell said, dismissing the heroism of those weeks with a wave of his hand. "That was a necessity. But the crisis has passed, Mrs. Hayes. And yet the association continues. He is a decent man," Clara said, her voice tightening. "And his family has suffered greatly. I check on his nephew, the boy I treated. It is not about decency, Mrs. Hayes," Caldwell said, his voice dropping to a tone of conspiratorial warning. "It is about order. It is about the natural separation of things. You are a white woman, a widow of good standing. You are the example to the children of this town. When they see you mingling with a savage, it confuses them. It disturbs the moral compass of the community." "He is not a savage," Clara said, the anger flaring in her chest. Caldwell's eyes snapped to hers, hard and cold. "He is a heathen, Mrs. Hayes. He does not know God, and more importantly, he is not of your blood. People are talking. They are saying that perhaps you have forgotten who you are. They are saying that perhaps you are not fit to guide the minds of their children if you cannot guide your own conduct." The threat hung in the air, naked and ugly. It was not just social isolation he was threatening, it was her livelihood. Without the school, she would starve. "I have done nothing immoral." "Reverend," Clara said, her voice shaking slightly. "Appearances are everything." "Clara," he said, using her first name to emphasize his authority. "Scriptural law warns us not to be unequally yoked. I suggest you reflect on that. If you continue on this path, you may find that the town can no longer support you. We protect our own, but we must know that you are, indeed, one of our own." He placed his hat on his head and walked out, leaving the door open to the gray, damp afternoon. Clara stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs. She felt trapped. The town was closing ranks, pushing her out toward the edge of the world. While Clara fought battles of reputation, Chaska was fighting a battle for survival. The mud of the spring made the roads impassable for heavy wagons, delaying the government rations that were already months late. Hunger was becoming a constant companion in the Lakota camp, but a more dangerous hunger was growing in the valley, the hunger of Amos Rigg. Rigg was a cattleman of the new breed. He did not drive herds, he built an empire. He was a heavy man with a red face and eyes buried in flesh, but his mind was sharp and ruthless. He wanted the valley where the Lakota had set their winter camp. It was sheltered, with good water and grass that greened early. The trouble began with a fire. A barn on the edge of Rigg's property went up in flames one night, painting the low clouds orange. By morning, Rigg was in the town saloon, buying drinks and loudly proclaiming that he had seen 3 Lakota braves riding away from the blaze. "They are burning us out," Rigg shouted, slamming a fist onto the bar. "They want to drive us off so they can steal the stock. I say we don't wait for the army to file a report. I say we defend what is ours." Chaska heard the talk when he went to the fort to translate for the weekly briefing. He stood in the corner of the colonel's office, invisible until called upon. He watched Colonel Bragg, a tired man who just wanted his pension, nod wearily as Riggs shouted about depredations. But Chaska also saw the other man in the room, Lieutenant Hayes. The lieutenant was no relation to Clara, though they shared a name common enough in the East. He was young, ambitious, and possessed a cruelty that sat just beneath his polished manners like a coiled snake. He hated the frontier, and he hated the Lakota, whom he viewed as an obstacle to his promotion. He listened to Riggs with a gleam in his eye. Chaska knew, with the instinct of a man who had hunted wolves, that the fire was a lie. Riggs had burned his own barn. It was an old structure, rotting and empty. It was a small price to pay for a pretext to call in the cavalry. That evening, Chaska rode to the schoolhouse. He told himself he was going to ask Clara for more willow bark for his sister, who was suffering from joint pain in the damp weather. But as he tied his horse to the rail, he knew that was only half the truth. He needed to see her. He needed to look at someone who did not see him as a tool or a target. Clara opened the door before he could knock. She looked tired, circles of purple shadowing her eyes. "Chaska," she said, stepping back to let him in. "You should not be here. The Reverend was here. They are watching." "I will not stay long," Chaska said, remaining near the door. The air in the room was warm and smelled of chalk and dried herbs. It smelled of her. "I came for the willow bark. For Winona." Clara moved to her cupboard, her movements jerky with tension. She began filling a small sack. "You look burdened," she said, not turning around. "Your shoulders are carrying the sky today." Chaska watched her back. He wanted to tell her everything. He wanted to cross the room and rest his forehead against hers, but he stayed where he was. "It is the spring," he said. "It is a hard time." Clara turned, holding the sack. She looked at him, her gaze piercing through his evasion. "Do not lie to me, Chaska," she said softly. "I heard about the fire at Riggs' ranch. I heard what they are saying in town. They are blaming your people." "It is a lie," Chaska said, the bitterness spilling out. "Riggs burned it himself. I found tracks near the creek that crossed back toward his bunkhouse. Shod horses. My people do not shoe their ponies." "You must tell the colonel," Clara said, stepping closer. "The colonel listens to the wind that blows the loudest." Chaska said, "And right now, Riggs is screaming, and he has found an ally." "The lieutenant. Lieutenant Hayes?" Clara asked. Chaska nodded. "He is a man who wants war. He thinks a victory against hostiles will send him back to Washington with a medal. He and Riggs are weaving a net. They will use the fear of an uprising to justify a raid. They want the valley, and they want to break us." Clara's face went pale. "A raid? But there are women and children there. Old people. They do not care." Chaska said, "To them, we are not people. We are a problem to be solved with lead." "I will speak to the colonel," Clara said, a fierce light igniting in her eyes. "I will tell him what you found. I will tell him Riggs is a liar." "No!" Chaska's voice was sharp, startling them both. He took a step forward, his hand raising as if to stop her physically. "You must not—" "Why?" Clara demanded. "Because I am a woman? Because you are already in danger," Chaska said, his voice dropping to an intense whisper. "If you speak for us now, after the gossip, after the window was broken, they will say you have turned traitor. They will say I have bewitched you. It will not help my people, and it will destroy you. The lieutenant hates me. Clara, if he thinks you are my ally, he will use you to hurt me." Clara stared at him, the reality of his words sinking in. She saw the fear in his eyes, not fear for himself, but fear for her. "So we do nothing?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We wait for them to come?" "We wait," Chaska said. "I will watch. I will try to keep the young men from doing anything foolish that Riggs can use as an excuse. We must be stone. We must endure." He took the sack of bark from her hand. His fingers brushed hers, warm and rough. The contact sent a jolt through him that almost made him drop the bag. "Stay safe. Clara Hayes," he said. He turned and left, disappearing into the gray twilight. But Clara could not be stone. She was water, pliable, perhaps, but persistent. She could not march into the colonel's office, but she could listen. In the days that followed, Clara became a ghost in her own town. She went to the general store and lingered over the dry goods, her ears straining to catch the conversations of the ranch hands near the stove. She sewed near her open window when the soldiers rode past, listening to their banter. She learned small things. She heard a drunken drover from Riggs' outfit brag about lighting up the night. She noted which supplies were being loaded onto the army wagons, extra ammunition, field rations. She kept a small journal hidden under her mattress, recording dates, times, and names. It was a fragile shield against the coming violence, but it was the only one she had. A week later, on a Saturday when the school was closed, Clara walked out to the Lakota camp. She took the long way, following the creek bed to stay out of sight of the road. She told herself she was going to check on the boy's leg, but the pull in her chest was for the uncle, not the nephew. The camp was quiet. The mud was drying in patches, leaving cracked, brown earth. Chaska was sitting near the river, repairing a bridle. He saw her coming and rose, his face softening in a way that made Clara's breath catch. He did not scold her for coming. He seemed to accept that she was as stubborn as the land itself. "Come," he said, after she had checked the boy and left a jar of honey for the family. "I will show you something." He led her away from the camp, out onto the open prairie. The grass was beginning to turn green at the roots. The sky was a vast, tumbling ocean of clouds. He stopped at a patch of mud near a buffalo wallow. "What do you see?" he asked. Clara looked. "Mud," she said, "and some grass." Chaska smiled, a rare, fleeting expression that lit up his eyes. "Look closer," he said. He pointed a long finger at a faint depression in the earth. "A coyote passed here 2 hours ago," he said. "He was limping on his left front leg. See how the print is lighter?" Clara leaned in, squinting. She saw it then, the subtle difference in depth. "And here," Chaska said, gesturing to a broken stem of sagebrush. "A hawk struck a rabbit. See the drag marks, the struggle?" Clara looked at the chaos in the dirt, the story written in dust and violence. "How do you know it was 2 hours ago?" she asked. "The mud at the edge of the track has begun to dry, but the center is still wet." Chaska explained. "If it were fresh, the water would still be seeping. If it were old, the edges would be crumbling." He looked at her, and his voice took on a deeper resonance. "The land speaks, Clara. It tells us everything, if we are quiet enough to listen. The white men look at the land and see lines on a map. They see what they can take. We look at the land and see our relatives. We see the past and the future written in the grass." Clara looked out at the horizon. For the first time, the emptiness did not feel lonely. It felt full. It felt alive. "You love this land," she said softly. "It is my blood," Chaska answered. "And my blood is the land. We cannot be separated. That is why Rig will never understand. He thinks he can buy it or steal it, but you cannot own the wind." He looked at her, and the intensity of his gaze stripped away her defenses. "You are beginning to hear it too," he said. "I see it in your eyes. You are not just a visitor anymore." Clara felt a lump in her throat. She wanted to belong, not to the town with its rigid rules and cruel whispers, but to this vast, honest, breathing world he was showing her. The sky, which had been threatening all afternoon, suddenly darkened. A low rumble of thunder rolled across the plains, vibrating in the soles of their boots. The temperature dropped sharply. "We must go," Chaska said, looking up. "It will be a bad one." They hurried back toward the town. The rain began as they reached the schoolhouse. Huge, heavy drops that exploded in the dust. By the time they got the door open, the heavens opened up. They tumbled inside, breathless and wet. The rain hammered on the roof with a deafening roar. The world outside disappeared, reduced to a wall of gray water. Clara lit a candle. The small flame flickered, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The schoolhouse felt like a ship at sea, isolated and fragile. They stood by the stove, shivering slightly. The air was charged, heavy with the ozone of the storm and the proximity of their bodies. "You cannot ride back in this," Clara said, wringing out the hem of her skirt. "You will have to wait it out." Chaska nodded. He took off his wet coat and hung it by the door. He stood in his shirt and vest, looking larger than usual in the small room. They sat on the benches near the stove. The thunder shook the floorboards to fill the silence, to drown out the storm and the pounding of their own hearts. They began to speak. They spoke not of the danger or the gossip, but of the things that came before. Chaska spoke of his childhood. He told her of the summer buffalo hunts, the earth shaking under 10,000 hooves. He told her of the sun dance, the sacrifice, and the ecstasy. "I had a brother," he said quietly, staring at the candle flame. "His name was Maddo. He was faster than me, stronger." He laughed more. "What happened to him?" Clara asked. "Soldiers," Chaska said, "near the Powder River. He was bringing horses back to camp. They said he was stealing them. He was not. They shot him in the back." Clara reached out, her hand hovering over his arm before she let it drop to the bench. "I am so sorry." Chaska looked at her. "I hated all white people for a long time. I wanted to kill them all, but hate is a poison you drink yourself, hoping the other person dies. It did not bring Maddo back." Clara looked down at her hands. "My father was a gentleman," she said. "He owned a general store in Ohio. He never raised his voice, but he bought land speculation bonds. He invested in the railroad. He cheered when the news came of new territories opening up." She looked up at Chaska, her eyes wet. "I am here because of men like my father. I am here because we wanted what was yours. Every bite of food I eat, every log in this wall, it is stolen. I feel the guilt of it every day. I look at you, and I feel like a thief." Chaska reached out then. He covered her hand with his own. His skin was dark against her pale fingers. "You are not a thief, Clara," he said firmly. "You are just a leaf on the river. Like me, we go where the current takes us. You did not choose where you were born. You choose only how you live now, and you live with honor." The touch of his hand was electric. Clara looked up at him, the candlelight reflected in his dark eyes, which were filled with a sorrow and a tenderness that broke her heart. The storm raged outside, a chaotic fury, but inside, the silence deepened. The air grew thick. Clara could feel the heat radiating from him. She could see the pulse beating in the hollow of his throat. She did not pull her hand away. Instead, she turned it, interlacing her fingers with his. "Chaska," she whispered. He leaned in. The movement was slow, a question asked in the space between them. Clara did not retreat. She leaned forward to meet him. Their lips touched tentatively at first, a brush of softness, a testing of the impossible. Then, a groan vibrated in Chaska's chest, low and hungry. He shifted, his other hand coming up to cup her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. The kiss deepened, breaking open like a dam. It was desperate. It was the taste of rain and wood smoke and months of denied longing. Clara's hands found the front of his shirt, gripping the fabric to pull him closer. Chaska's arm went around her waist, pulling her against him until there was no air left between them. For a moment, there was no town, no rig, no army, no difference of blood or history. There was only this, the frantic, terrifying, beautiful collision of two lonely souls. Then, the reality crashed back in. Chaska tore his mouth away, gasping for air. He pulled back, his chest heaving. He looked at her, his eyes wide, the pupils blown black. His hand was still on her face, his fingers trembling. "No," he whispered. His voice was rough, shredded by desire and fear. "No, we cannot." Clara reached for him, her body aching with the sudden loss of contact. "Why?" "Because," Chaska said, pulling his hand away as if her skin burned him. "If they find out, if they know." "They will destroy you. Clara, they will burn this school. They will run you out into the wilderness." "I don't care," Clara said, and she meant it. In that moment, She would have burned the world down to feel his mouth on hers again. "I care," Chaska said fiercely. He stood up, putting distance between them. "I cannot be the reason you lose everything. And if they find me with you, like this, they will not just jail me. They will hang me from the cottonwood by the river." The brutal truth of his words hit Clara like a slap. She slumped back on the bench, bringing her fingers to her lips, which still tingled with the memory of him. Chaska walked to the window, staring out at the rain-lashed darkness. He stood with his back to her, rigid and tense. "We must be careful," he said, his voice flat and hard, rebuilding the walls he had just torn down. "We must never do that again." Clara looked at his broad back. She knew he was right. She knew the danger was lethal. But as she listened to the thunder roll away into the distance, she knew something else. Too, they had crossed the line, and no matter what he said, no matter how high they built the walls, they could never go back to being strangers. The storm had passed, but the lightning had already struck. The summer of the late 1870s descended upon the Dakota territory like a judgment. The gentle green of the spring vanished, replaced by a brown, brittle landscape that crunched underfoot. The sun was a white-hot coin pressed against the sky, bleaching the color from the earth and shimmering in waves of heat off the horizon. Dust was everywhere. It sifted through the cracks in the window frames, coated the leaves of the cottonwood trees in gray powder, and gritted between the teeth of every man, woman, and child in Iron Creek. Tempers in the town rose with the mercury. Men fought over seats in the saloon. Horses snapped at their tethers, and the unease that had been simmering all winter began to boil. Amos Rigg fanned the flames. The cattleman rode into town on a Tuesday, his face red and sweating. His horse lathered despite the slow pace. He marched straight to the fort, demanding an audience with Colonel Bragg. 30 head, Rigg bellowed, his voice carrying through the open windows of the commander's office to where Chaska stood in the dusty courtyard. 30 head of prime beef, gone in the night. And I know who took them. Chaska stiffened. He was repairing a stirrup leather for one of the cavalry mounts, a menial task assigned to keep him busy. He listened as Rigg spun his tale. The cattleman claimed to have seen tracks, unshod ponies, driving the herd north toward the river where the Lakota were camped. It was a clumsy lie. Chaska knew the ground near Rigg's pasture. It was baked hard as stone. It would take an expert tracker to read sign there, and Rigg could barely track a wagon on a muddy road. Furthermore, the Lakota hunters had been ranging south, not east, following the thinning buffalo herds. They had no use for Rigg's slow, fat cattle when the deer were moving, but truth mattered little in the heat. Colonel Bragg, wiping his forehead with a damp handkerchief, looked at Rigg. "Are you certain, Mr. Rigg? This is a serious accusation. To move against the camp requires justification. I saw what I saw. Colonel, Rigg insisted. And if the army will not protect the taxpayers of this territory, then perhaps we will have to protect ourselves. I have 20 men ready to ride." It was a threat, veiled but clear. If the army did not act, there would be a vigilante war. Bragg, fearing a bloodbath that would look bad in his reports to Washington, capitulated. "We will conduct a search," Bragg said wearily. "If we find the cattle, or evidence of them, we will make arrests." Chaska dropped the stirrup leather. He walked to the door of the office. "Colonel," Chaska said, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart, "let me ride ahead. Let me speak to the elders. If there are cattle there, which I do not believe, I will bring them back. Do not send the soldiers in force. It will cause panic." Lieutenant Hayes, who had been leaning against the wall cleaning his fingernails with a knife, looked up. He smiled, a cold, thin expression. "Send the fox to warn the henhouse?" Hayes asked. "I think not. You will ride with us. Translator, we need you to tell them to surrender the stolen property, or to tell them to say their prayers." The order was given. A detachment of 40 men, heavily armed, would ride at dawn. It was called a search operation, but every man checking his carbine knew it was a raid. News traveled fast in a small town. Clara Hayes heard it at the mercantile while buying cornmeal. The gossip was vicious and excited. Mrs. Miller was telling anyone who would listen that Rig was finally going to clean out the nest of vipers by the river. Clara felt a cold knot of dread tighten in her stomach. She left her basket on the counter and walked out into the blinding sunlight. She had to do something. She could not ride to the camp. She had no horse of her own, and to rent one now would arouse too much suspicion. She saw Lieutenant Hayes coming out of the barber shop, smelling of bay rum and confidence. He adjusted his hat, checking his reflection in the window. "Lieutenant," Clara called out, hurrying across the dusty street. Hayes turned, his expression shifting from vanity to a mocking politeness. "Ah, the other Mrs. Hayes. To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I heard about the operation," Clara said, breathless. "Lieutenant, you must listen. This is a mistake. The Lakota are starving." "They have not taken the cattle. I was there 3 days ago to bring medicine. There is no beef in that camp." Hayes laughed softly, dusting a speck of lint from his sleeve. "You were there." "Were you?" he said, his voice dropping to a sneer. "You spend a great deal of time with our red brothers, don't you, Clara? Some might say too much time." "I am telling you the truth," Clara said, ignoring the insult. "Rig is lying. He wants that valley for grazing. If you go in there with guns, innocent people will die." "Innocent?" Hayes raised an eyebrow. "They are savages, my dear. They understand only force. And frankly, your sentimentalism is becoming tiresome. It is one thing to play nursemaid to a sick child. It is another to interfere in military matters." He stepped closer, invading her personal space. "Go back to your schoolhouse. Clara, teach the alphabet, sew a quilt, leave the fighting to the men, and take a piece of advice. Stop worrying about the Indian. It makes people wonder where your loyalties lie. And in times like these, loyalty is everything." He tipped his hat and walked away, his spurs jingling in the dust. Clara stood there, trembling with rage and helplessness. She watched him mount his horse and ride toward the fort. She realized then that the cruelty was not accidental. It was the point. The raid began at high noon, when the sun was directly overhead, stripping away all shadows. The soldiers crested the ridge above the Lakota camp, a long blue line against the brown grass. Chaska rode near the front, flanked by 2 privates who had been ordered to watch him. His chest felt constricted, as if an iron band were tightening around his ribs. He looked down at the camp. It was peaceful. Women were scraping hides near the river. Children were playing a game with sticks and a hoop. Smoke curled lazily from the tops of the lodges. There were no cattle. Colonel Bragg raised his hand. "Forward, walk." The column descended. The sound of jangling bits and creaking leather alerted the camp. Dogs began to bark. The women stopped their work, shading their eyes. Warriors grabbed their weapons, rushing out of the lodges, but they did not fire. They stood in front of the women and children, waiting. Rig and his men were riding with the soldiers as civilian scouts. As they neared the camp, Rig shouted, pointing toward a stand of brush near the horse herd. "There! I see the brands!" It was the signal. Before the colonel could give an order, Rig's men spurred their horses, charging the camp, firing their pistols into the air. Panic erupted. The women grabbed the children, running for the river. The warriors raised their rifles, but the soldiers, reacting to the gunfire from Rig's men, opened fire as well. "Stop!" Chaska screamed, kicking his horse forward. "Stop! There are no cattle!" A private grabbed his reins, jerking his horse back. "Stay in formation! Indian!" Chaska watched in horror as the discipline of the army crumbled into chaos. Rig's men were not looking for cattle. They were looking for destruction. One of them threw a lit torch onto the dry canvas of a lodge. The fire caught instantly, roaring up the side of the teepee. The wind carried the sparks. Within seconds, 3 lodges were burning. The screams of the women cut through the crackle of rifle fire. Chaska saw his sister, Winona, stumble out of her burning lodge, dragging her son. She fell, choking on the smoke. "Winona!" Chaska roared, He drove his heels into his horse's flanks. The animal surged forward, breaking the private's grip on the reins. Chaska galloped through the confusion, dodging a soldier who swung a saber at him. He reached his sister, leaping from the saddle while the horse was still moving. He grabbed Winona, hoisting her up. He grabbed the boy, tucking him under his arm. "Run to the river," he shouted in Lakota. "Go into the willows." As he pushed them towards safety, a shot rang out, close and loud. Chaska turned. 10 yards away. His uncle, the old man who had looked at Clara with such suspicion, was standing his ground, holding only a feathered staff. He was shouting at the soldiers to stop. One of Riggs' men, a man with a scar across his nose, raised his rifle and fired. The old man's head snapped back. He crumpled to the ground, the feathers on his staff fluttering as they hit the dust. "No!" Chaska screamed. He lunged toward the shooter, his knife drawn, blind with grief and rage. "Stand down." Lieutenant Hayes was there, his revolver pointed at Chaska's chest. 2 soldiers tackled Chaska from behind, slamming him into the dirt. They pinned his arms, pressing his face into the ash and dust. "He attacked a civilian!" Hayes shouted. "I saw it! Restrain him!" Chaska struggled, spitting dirt, watching the flames consume his home. He watched Riggs' men riding through the smoke, whooping like demons. He saw the body of his uncle lying still in the dirt, a small red pool widening beneath his head. The raid ended as quickly as it had begun. The camp was in ruins. Half the lodges were burned. The Lakota had fled into the brush. Hayes walked over to a clump of bushes near the edge of the camp. He reached in and pulled out a fresh cowhide, branded with Riggs' mark. "Look at this." "Colonel," Hayes said, holding up the bloody skin. "They butchered the evidence. It was fresh, too fresh. The blood was still wet. It had been planted there, likely by one of Riggs' men during the charge." Chaska, dragged to his feet by the soldiers, stared at the hide. "You brought that with you," he spat, his voice shaking with fury. "Silence!" Hayes struck him across the face with the back of his gloved hand. The ride back to the fort was a funeral procession. Chaska was not bound, but he was surrounded. He rode with his head up, refusing to show pain, but inside, he was burning hotter than the fires in the valley. At the fort, Colonel Bragg sat behind his desk, looking pale. He knew the raid had gone wrong. He knew an unarmed elder had been killed. "We recovered evidence of the theft," Hayes said, placing his report on the desk. "The hostiles resisted. Casualties were unavoidable." Chaska stood in the corner, blood drying on his lip. "It is a lie," Chaska said. His voice was low, filling the room. "Riggs' men started the fire. They shot an old man who held no weapon, and that hide was brought in a saddlebag." "That is enough," Colonel Bragg said, rubbing his temples. "It is murder," Chaska said, stepping forward. "I will not translate your lies anymore. I will write to the Indian agent. I will tell them what happened." Hayes turned to Chaska, his eyes narrowing. "You are walking a dangerous line. Scout, you are an employee of the United States Army. Insubordination is a crime. And murder is a sin," Chaska countered. "You are a coward. Hayes, you let Rigg do your killing for you." Hayes's face went white. His hand dropped to his gun, but he stopped. There were too many witnesses in the room. "Get him out of here," Bragg ordered. "Dismissed." Chaska walked out, but as he left, he saw the look in Hayes's eyes. It was the look of a man who had decided that a problem needed to be removed permanently. 2 days passed. The town was buzzing with the news of the victory. Rigg was a hero. The Lakota had been taught a lesson. Then, on a Friday morning, the body was found. It was one of Riggs' ranch hands, a drifter named Miller, not related to the rancher family, who had been loud in the raid. He was found face down in the shallows of the river, a mile downstream from the town. His throat had been cut. Rigg rode into town with the body draped over a mule. He stopped in front of the sheriff's office, a crowd gathering instantly. "Look," Rigg shouted. "Look what they did." It was that scout, Chaska. "I saw him threaten Miller during the raid. He said he would make us pay in blood." It was another lie. Chaska had never spoken to Miller, but the town was ready to believe. They were afraid, and fear needed a target. Hayes arrived within the hour. He conferred with Rigg and the sheriff. "Arrest him," Hayes ordered. "We have a witness." Chaska was at the livery stable, tending to the horses. When the sheriff and 4 deputies arrived, he did not fight them. He knew it would be suicide. He let them clamp the heavy iron cuffs on his wrists. He let them drag him out into the street. The walk to the jail was a gauntlet. The town had turned out to watch the savage be brought to justice. Men spat at him. Women pulled their children back, whispering that he was a monster. "Hang him!" someone shouted from the back of the crowd. "Murderer!" Chaska walked with his head high, looking straight ahead. He saw the hate in their faces. He saw the satisfaction. They finally had proof that he was what they always said he was. Suddenly, the crowd parted. Clara Hayes stepped into the middle of the street. She was wearing her Sunday dress. Though it was a Friday, she looked small against the mob, but she stood like a rock in a river. She planted herself directly in the path of the sheriff and Chaska. "Stop," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the jeers. "Move aside, Mrs. Hayes," the sheriff grunted. "This is law business." "It is not law," Clara said, her voice rising. "It is a lynching disguised as law." She looked at Chaska. His face was bruised, his lips split again. He looked at her with a desperate warning in his eyes, begging her silently to move, to save herself. She ignored him. She turned to the crowd. "You all know this man," she shouted. "You have seen him work. You have seen him trade. He is not a murderer. He killed Miller." Riggs shouted from his horse. "Cut his throat like a steer." "Did he?" Clara challenged, turning to face the cattleman. "Or did Miller know something about your fire? Mr. Rigg, did Miller know that you burned those lodges? Did he know that the cattle brands were fake?" A murmur ran through the crowd. It was a dangerous accusation. "You watch your tongue, woman," Rigg growled, his hand drifting to his belt. "And you, Lieutenant," Clara said, spinning to face Hayes. "You stand there and let this happen? You know Chaska was at the fort last night. You saw him? I saw nothing of the sort," Hayes said smoothly. "And your defense of this criminal is noted. Clara, it confirms what everyone has been whispering, that you are a traitor to your race." The crowd began to turn on her. The sympathy she had once held as a widow was gone. Now, she was the enemy. "She is lovers with him," a woman shouted. "I saw them." "Shame," another cried. Clara felt the hatred wash over her, a physical wave of heat. She trembled, but she did not step down. She looked at Chaska. "I know him," she said, her voice breaking but loud enough to be heard. "I know his heart, and he is a better man than any of you." The sheriff shoved past her, knocking her into the dust. "Get her out of the way," he barked. Clara fell hard, scraping her hands. She watched from the ground as they dragged Chaska away. He turned his head to look at her, his eyes full of sorrow and gratitude. Then the jail door slammed shut, the heavy bar thudding into place. Night fell, hot and suffocating. The town celebrated. The saloon was roaring. The sheriff, celebrating a job well done, was passed out in his chair in the front office, a bottle of whiskey empty on the desk. Clara waited in the shadows of the alley until the snoring was rhythmic and deep. She wore a dark cloak, her face hidden. She carried a basket covered with a napkin. She slipped into the office. The sheriff snorted but did not wake. She took the ring of keys from the nail on the wall. Her hands shook so badly she almost dropped them. She unlocked the inner door to the cell block. It was a small stone room, stiflingly hot, smelling of damp earth and unwashed bodies. There was only one cell. Chaska was sitting on the narrow cot, his head in his hands. He looked up as the door creaked open. "Clara?" he whispered, standing up. The chains on his ankles clanked. She rushed to the bars. "Chaska," she breathed. She fumbled with the basket, pulling out a jar of salve and a clean cloth. "I brought this for your face." Chaska moved to the bars. He did not look at the medicine. He looked at her. "You should not be here," he said. "They will run you out of town for what you said today." "I do not care," Clara said. "I am done caring what they think." She reached through the bars, touching the bruise on his cheekbone. Her fingers were cool against his hot skin. "You are innocent," she said. "I know you are. They will hang me." "Clara," Chaska said, "Rig has paid the witnesses. Hayes wants me gone. There will be no trial, or if there is, it will be a farce." "No," Clara said fiercely. "I will find proof. I will go to the governor." "There is no time," Chaska said. He looked at her, and the defenses he had built, the stoicism, the distance, the honor, crumbled. He was a man standing on the edge of the abyss, and she was the only light in the darkness. Clara dropped the cloth. She pressed her body against the iron bars, reaching through with both arms to grab the lapels of his torn coat. "I love you," she said. The words came out in a rush, a confession she had held back for months. "I love you, Chaska. I cannot let them take you." Chaska stared at her. The admission hung in the stagnant air. He closed his eyes for a moment, a look of exquisite pain crossing his face. "Clara," he groaned. He fought the urge to pull her against the bars, to crush her to him. He knew it was hopeless. He knew he was a dead man, but the pull was too strong. He reached through the bars. He took her hands in his. His grip was desperate, bruising. He lifted her hands to his face. He kissed her knuckles, then her palms, burying his face in her hands. "I have loved you since the snow," he whispered against her skin. "I have loved you every day." Clara felt his tears wet her palms. She pressed her forehead against the cold iron bar, and he did the same on the other side. They were separated by 3 inches of metal and 1,000 miles of prejudice. But in that moment, they were one. "Listen to me," Chaska said, pulling back to look into her eyes. His face was fierce. "If they kill me, you must leave. Go back east. Do not stay here. They will destroy you. I am not going anywhere without you." Clara vowed. "Promise me," Chaska demanded. "Promise me you will be safe. I promise I will save you," Clara said. She pulled his head down and kissed him through the bars, a desperate, salty kiss that tasted of goodbyes. Then she heard the sheriff stir in the other room. "I have to go," she whispered. She pulled her hands away, her fingers trailing lingeringly over his. She locked the cell door, replaced the keys, and slipped out into the night. Chaska stood in the dark cell, listening to her footsteps fade. He touched his lips where she had kissed him. He felt the cold iron of the shackles on his wrists. But for the first time since the raid, he did not feel alone. He felt a terrified, dangerous hope, and he knew that if he was going to die, he would die loving her. The Dakota sky turned a bruised and angry purple, the color of a healing wound. As Clara Hayes rode out to the ruins of the Lakota camp, the heat that had baked the plains for weeks had broken violently, replaced by a volatile atmosphere where thunderheads piled atop one another like mountains of slate. She had rented a buckboard from the livery, paying 3 times the usual rate because the owner, Mr. Hansen, had spat on the ground when she asked. He took her money, though they always took the money. Clara tied the horse to a scorched cottonwood tree and walked into the devastation. The smell of wet ash and death still hung heavy in the air, despite the wind. The silence was absolute. There were no dogs barking, no children laughing, no drum beats, just the hollow sound of the wind whistling through the skeletons of the burned lodges. She walked slowly, her boots crunching on the debris. She looked down and saw shards of pottery, a bowl she had seen Winona using to mix stew just a week ago, shattered into jagged pieces. It felt like walking on bones. Clara was not here to mourn. She was here to hunt. She moved to the perimeter of the camp, where the grass gave way to the scrub brush leading up the ridge. Rig claimed the Lakota had stolen cattle and driven them here. If that were true, the ground would be churned deep with hundreds of hoof prints. She found the tracks. They were there, but they told a different story. She knelt in the dirt, heedless of the stain on her skirts. The tracks were deep, made by heavy, iron-shod horses, American horses, not Lakota ponies. And they did not lead from the grazing lands into the camp. They led from the direction of Riggs Ranch, down into the valley, and then back out again. They rode in to attack, not to reclaim. Clara whispered to herself. She followed the tracks into a dense thicket of choke cherry bushes near the property line that separated the reservation land from the open range. Something white caught her eye in the tangle of thorns. She reached in, her gloves snagging on the briars. She pulled out a scrap of fabric. It was a piece of heavy canvas, stained with grease and dirt. It was a check pattern, red and black. Clara's breath hitched. She had seen that coat. Miller, the dead ranch hand, had worn a coat of that exact pattern. He had been here. He had torn it pushing through the brush, likely while planting the evidence or setting the fires. She pushed deeper into the brush. The smell of rotting meat assaulted her. Hidden beneath a pile of hastily cut tumbleweeds lay a pile of raw cow hides. She pulled the brush away. The hides were stiff, crawling with flies. She turned one over. The brand, Riggs Double Bar, was clear, but the cut marks on the hide were clumsy, and the animal had been skinned inexpertly. These were not butchered for food. They were butchered for the brand. Clara stood up, her head swimming. It was all a stage play. Rigg had killed his own cattle, skinned them, and planted the hides. Miller had been part of it, and Miller was dead because he knew too much. As she drove back toward town, the sky opened up. It did not rain. It hailed. Balls of ice the size of walnuts hammered the earth, flattening the wheat in the fields and tearing the leaves from the trees. Clara huddled under the seat of the buckboard, listening to the deafening roar of the ice, feeling the violence of the land mirroring the violence in her heart. She had the truth. Now she needed a voice. She found Private Jenkins behind the livery stable, smoking a cigarette with shaking hands. He was young, barely 19, with a face that was not yet hard enough for the frontier. Clara had treated him for a fever in the spring, and he had looked at her with puppy-dog devotion ever since. "Private," Clara said, emerging from the rain that followed the hail. Jenkins jumped, dropping his smoke. "Mrs. Hayes, you shouldn't be out. It is wild weather. I know what happened at the camp." "Jenkins," Clara said, her voice low and urgent. "I know Riggs' men started the fire. I know there were no stolen cattle." Jenkins went pale. He looked around, terrified. "Mrs. Hayes, please, you can't talk like that." The lieutenant is a liar," Clara said, stepping closer. "And he is going to hang an innocent man. Chaska saved your life during the blizzard 2 years ago, didn't he? He found you when you were lost on patrol." Jenkins swallowed hard. He looked at his boots. "Are you going to let them kill him?" Clara asked. "They will kill me if I talk," Jenkins whispered. "Hayes. He has eyes everywhere. I saw it. Mrs. Hayes. I saw Riggs' foreman throw the torch. I saw them laughing. But if I testify, I will be court-martialed. Or found in the river like Miller." "You don't have to testify yet," Clara said. "Just tell me, if I can get the colonel to open an inquiry. Will you speak the truth? If you are under oath and protected." Jenkins looked at her, tears mixing with the rain on his face. He nodded. A jerky, frightened movement. "If the colonel asks, I won't lie to the colonel, but I won't stand up against Hayes alone." It was enough. It had to be enough. While Clara fought the storm outside, Chaska sat in the suffocating heat of the jail cell. The storm had passed over the town, leaving the air thick and heavy, like a wet wool blanket. He sat on the edge of the narrow cot, his hands resting on his knees. The shackles on his wrists chafed his skin, raw and bleeding. He did not feel the pain. His mind was drifting, untethered by grief and exhaustion. He closed his eyes and he was 6 years old again, running through the tall grass of the Powder River country. The world was huge and open, without fences, without forts. He saw his brother, Maddo, laughing as he chased a butterfly. He saw the smoke of the council fires and heard the songs of the elders. Then the memory shifted. He saw Maddo face down in the dirt, a bullet hole in his back. He saw the treaties signed on paper that crumbled like dry leaves. He saw the faces of the white men, always angry, always hungry, always taking. He opened his eyes. The stone walls of the cell closed in. He was going to die here. He knew the rhythm of this song. The town wanted blood. Rigg needed a scapegoat. Hayes needed silence. He should have accepted his death. It was the warrior's way to meet the end with stoicism, but he could not find his peace. Every time he tried to let go, he saw Clara's face. He saw her blue eyes, fierce and stubborn. He felt the phantom touch of her hand on his cheek. He did not want to die. He wanted to live. He wanted to wake up in a house where the wind did not scream through the walls, with Clara sleeping beside him. The desire was a physical ache, sharper than the iron on his wrists. The sun went down, turning the cell into a box of shadows. The outer door opened. Chaska did not look up. He expected the sheriff with a bucket of slop, or perhaps a drunk deputy coming to taunt him. "Good evening, Sheriff." The voice made Chaska's head snap up. It was Clara. Sheriff Webb was slumped at his desk, a half-empty bottle of whiskey in front of him. He blinked blearily at Clara. She was holding a covered basket, and behind her stood his wife, Mrs. Webb. "Now, Earl." "Mrs. Webb said, her voice sharp. "I told Mrs. Hayes she could bring the prisoner some decent food. You know the county doesn't feed them fit for a dog, and I won't have it on my conscience." The sheriff grunted, waving a hand dismissively. "Just make it quick, and don't give him no knife to eat with." Clara stepped past the desk. She looked at Mrs. Webb. "Thank you, Martha." Mrs. Webb nodded, looking uncomfortable. "Just be quick, Clara." Clara moved to the cell door. The sheriff had left the keys on the hook. Mrs. Webb nudged her husband. "Earl, come on back to the house. I have supper ready. Let her feed him. I gotta watch," the sheriff mumbled, his head lolling. "You can watch from the chair, Mrs. Webb said, rolling her eyes. She signaled to Clara with a quick, nervous gesture. 5 minutes. Clara took the keys. Her hands were steady now. She unlocked the heavy iron door. It swung open with a groan of rusted hinges. She stepped inside. Chaska stood up. The cell was so small that she was instantly in his space. The air in the cell was stale, smelling of old straw and sweat. But when she entered, she brought the scent of rain and lavender soap. "Clara." Chaska breathed. She put the basket on the floor without looking at it. She turned to the door, pushing it mostly closed so the sheriff, if he looked up, would see only the iron bars, not the two of them huddled in the corner. She turned back to him. In the dim light filtering from the hallway lantern, her face was pale, her eyes dark with an intensity that frightened him. "I found it," she whispered. "I found the cloth from Miller's coat at the camp, and the hides. They were planted." "Chaska," she reached out, her hands hovering near his chest. "I have a witness," she said. "Private Jenkins. He saw them start the fire." Chaska looked at her. She was risking everything. Every second she stood here, she was tightening the noose around her own social standing, her own safety. "You are crazy," he murmured, shaking his head. "You are a crazy, stubborn woman." "I am your woman," she said. The words hung in the air, absolute and undeniable. Chaska's resolve shattered. The fear of death, the caution of years, the walls of race and culture, they all dissolved in the heat of that small, stone room. He reached for her. His shackled hands came up, cupping her face. He pulled her to him, and she came willingly, crashing against his chest. Their mouths met in a collision of desperation. It was not gentle. It was a starving thing. Clara's hands gripped the lapels of his coat, pulling him down. Chaska's arms went around her, crushing her ribs, lifting her off her feet. He spun her around, pressing her back against the rough stone wall, his body shielding her from the door. He kissed her throat, her jaw, her mouth again, drinking in the taste of her. Clara gasped, her fingers tangling in his long hair. She felt the cold metal of his chains against her neck, a contrast to the searing heat of his skin. "I thought I would never see you again," she whispered against his lips. "I am here," he groaned. "I am here." He lifted her effortlessly, swinging her away from the wall and toward the small, wooden table bolted to the floor. He set her on the edge of it. Stepping between her knees, his hands moved to her hips, gripping her waist through the fabric of her dress. His thumbs dug in, anchoring her, anchoring him. "Don't move," he commanded. His voice was a low rumble, barely a breath. It was a command born of necessity. The table creaked, the chains clanked, but it trembled with a raw, terrifying desire. Clara froze, her hands gripping his shoulders. She looked down at him. His face was turned up to hers, open and vulnerable in a way she had never seen. His eyes were black pools of want. "Don't move," he said again, softer this time. "If we make a sound." He did not finish. He leaned his forehead against her chest, his breath hot through the cotton of her bodice. Clara could feel his heart hammering against her own. She wrapped her legs around his waist, pulling him closer, defying the space between them. For a minute, 60 seconds that stretched into an eternity, they just existed, held together by fear and love in a cage of stone. It was the most intimate moment of Clara's life. She felt the strength of his thighs, the roughness of his hands, the desperate, jagged rhythm of his breathing. She wanted him. She wanted to lie back on that hard table and let the rest of the world burn down around them. She wanted to claim this fragile, forbidden thing and make it real. Chaska pulled back slightly. He looked at her mouth, swollen from his kisses. He looked at the pulse fluttering in her throat. "We cannot," he whispered, his voice sounding like it was being torn from his throat. "Not here, not like this." Clara nodded, tears spilling over her lashes. "I know." He rested his forehead against hers. "You must go," he said, "before he wakes." Clara slipped off the table. Her legs felt weak. She smoothed her skirt, though her hands were trembling violently. "I will bring the proof tomorrow," she said, her voice regaining its steel. "The hearing is at 10 o'clock. I will make them listen." Chaska took her hands one last time. "If it goes wrong," he said, looking deep into her eyes, "if Hayes turns it, promise me you will walk away. Do not go down with me." "I am not walking away," Clara said. "I am walking through it. With you." She kissed his palms, turned, and slipped out the door. She locked it behind her, the click of the mechanism sounding like a gunshot in the quiet office. The sheriff snorted and shifted in his sleep. Clara walked out into the night, the taste of Chaska still on her lips, ready to go to war. The town hall was packed. The air inside was stifling, a mixture of unwashed bodies, tobacco smoke, and anticipation. Dust motes spun in the hard beams of sunlight that cut through the high windows, illuminating the grim faces of the townsfolk. They had come for a show. They had come to see the savage condemned. Colonel Bragg sat at a long table at the front of the room, looking uncomfortable in his dress uniform. Beside him sat the town magistrate, a man named Henderson who owed Rigg money. Chaska sat on a stool to the left, still in chains. He looked at the floor, his face impassive. Rigg took the stand first. He wore a clean suit and an expression of righteous indignation. He spun his tale with practiced ease, the missing cattle, the hostile intent, the savage murder of his man Miller. "He is a dog that bit the hand that fed him," Rigg declared, pointing a thick finger at Chaska. "We tried to live in peace, but they only understand blood." The crowd murmured in agreement. Then Lieutenant Hayes took the stand. He was smooth, articulate, and deadly. He corroborated Rigg's story, adding military jargon to give it weight. He painted Chaska as a dangerous radical who had infiltrated the fort to spy for his people. "We found the stolen hides," Hayes said, holding up his hands. "The evidence is irrefutable." When it was Clara's turn, a hush fell over the room. It was not a respectful silence. It was heavy with judgment. Clara walked to the front. She wore her best black dress. She carried a small bundle wrapped in paper. "Mrs. Hayes," Colonel Bragg said, "you asked to speak. Make it brief." Clara turned to the room. She did not look at Chaska. She looked at the faces of the people she had lived with for 3 years. "I went to the burned camp," she said clearly. A ripple of shock went through the crowd. "I found these." She unwrapped the bundle. She held up the piece of red and black check cloth. "This cloth was found in the brush near the reservation line," Clara said. "It matches the coat worn by Mr. Miller. The tear is fresh." She reached into the bundle again. "And I found tracks," Shod horses, riding from the Rig Ranch, attacking the camp, and riding back. Lies, Riggs shouted, standing up. She's lying to protect her lover. Sit down. Mr. Rigg, Bragg barked. Continue, Mrs. Hayes, I spoke to a soldier, Clara said, her voice shaking but gaining strength. A man who was there. He admitted that he saw Riggs' men start the fire. He admitted there were no cattle in that camp until your men planted the hides. Name him, Hayes demanded, stepping forward. If you have a witness, produce him. He is terrified of you, Lieutenant, Clara said, turning to face him. Because he knows what happened to Miller. Miller didn't die by Lakota hands. He died because he knew the raid was a fraud. Hayes laughed. It was a cold, ugly sound. This is pathetic, he said. A woman's fantasies. Colonel, are we really going to listen to this? Everyone in this room knows why she is doing this. He turned to the crowd, spreading his arms. Look at her. A white woman. A widow. Debasing herself for a savage. It is not justice she wants. It is him. Her judgment is clouded by unnatural affections. The room bristled. The insult was clear. Clara stood very still. She felt the shame trying to take root, trying to silence her. But she remembered the heat of Chaska's hands on her hips. She remembered the promise. Yes, Clara said. Her voice rang out, silencing the murmurs. I care for him. I do not deny it. The crowd gasped. Mrs. Miller put a hand over her mouth. I care for him because he is honorable. Clara continued, her voice rising. He saved my life in the blizzard. He saved your nephew, Mrs. Gable, when the fever took him. He has served this territory with more dignity than any man in this room. She pointed at Hayes. You ask why I defend him? I ask you. Why is love treated as more dangerous than your lies? Why is my affection for a good man a sin, while your greed, your murder, your theft of land, why is that called justice? She turned to the colonel. If you hang him, Colonel, you are hanging an innocent man to cover up a crime, and I will not let you do it in the dark. I will write to Washington. I will write to every newspaper in the East. I will make sure the world knows that the United States Army acted as hired thugs for a cattle baron. Clara slammed the bundle of evidence onto the table. Silence reigned. The dust motes kept spinning. Indifferent to the drama, Colonel Bragg looked at the cloth. He looked at Rigg, whose face was purple. He looked at Hayes, who was sneering, and he looked at Chaska, who was watching Clara with a look of awe. Bragg was a weak man, but he was not a complete fool. He saw the doubt in the faces of some of the soldiers. He knew that if Clara truly wrote to the papers, an inquiry would destroy his pension, but he could not let a white woman humiliate his officer. He could not free a Lakota accused of killing a white man without a riot. He cleared his throat. The evidence presented by Mrs. Hayes is troubling, Bragg said slowly. However, it is circumstantial. We have no sworn testimony from this alleged witness. He shuffled his papers. I cannot dismiss the charges. However, given the conflicting accounts, I'm ordering that the prisoner be remanded to military custody for further inquiry. He will be transferred to the Fort Stockade until a federal judge can arrive in the autumn. It was a non-decision. It was a stall. But as Clara looked at Hayes, she saw the triumph in his eyes. Remanded to military custody meant Chaska would be under Hayes's control. It meant he would be in the stockade, guarded by Hayes's men. Hayes leaned over to Clara as the gavel banged. Further inquiry, he whispered. That means a long ride, Clara, and prisoners often try to escape on long rides. Shame if he were to be shot while fleeing. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. She had saved him from the rope, only to hand him over to the executioner. Chaska was hauled to his feet. He looked at Clara across the room. He did not smile. He knew exactly what the verdict meant. I will come for you, Clara called out as they dragged him away. But her voice was lost in the noise of the crowd, leaving her standing alone in the center of the hall. The evidence of his innocence lying ignored on the table. The rumor moved through Iron Creek like a fever, unseen but felt in the heat of the air and the nervous glances of the men at the saloon. It started with a drunken boast from one of the deputies, whispered to a barmaid, who whispered it to the grocer, who whispered it to Clara Hayes as she bought a sack of coffee she did not need. "He is being moved at dawn," the grocer murmured, not looking her in the eye. "Lieutenant Hayes is taking him to the territorial prison. They say the prisoner is desperate. They say he might try to run." Clara gripped the counter, the rough wood digging into her palms. She knew what that meant. In the lexicon of the frontier justice system, trying to run was a euphemism for an execution. They would take Chaska out into the empty lands, far from witnesses, and they would put a bullet in his back. They would claim he escaped his irons and fled. They would write a report, file it in a dusty cabinet, and the problem of the Indian who dared to speak the truth would be solved. Clara walked out of the store into the blinding afternoon sun. The town looked the same as it always did, dusty, ambitious, cruel, but to her it looked like a graveyard. She had hours, only hours. She did not go to the sheriff. She did not go to the colonel. She went to the livery stable and saddled the mare she had bought 3 months ago. She packed a saddlebag with dried meat, bandages, and a heavy wool blanket. She pinned her hair up under a wide-brimmed hat and rode out, not toward the fort, but north, toward the Badlands where the Lakota had relocated after the raid. The ride was a punishment. The sun beat down on her shoulders, and the dust coated her throat. But she pushed the mare hard. She had to find them before nightfall. She had to convince them to trust her one last time. The new camp was hidden in a fold of the earth, a canyon of red rock and scrub cedar that was invisible until you were right on top of it. As Clara rode down the scree slope, a sentry whistled, sharp and high like a hawk. 2 warriors appeared from the rocks, rifles leveled at her chest. One of them was the cousin Chaska had mentioned, a young man named Red Hawk. He recognized her. He lowered his rifle slowly, his face a mask of grief and suspicion. "You should not be here," Red Hawk said. His English was rougher than Chaska's. "The soldiers will follow." "They are not following me," Clara said, sliding from the saddle. Her legs shook with exhaustion. "But they are going to kill Chaska at dawn." The news hit the camp like a physical blow. Winona came running from a lodge, her face thin and drawn. She grabbed Clara's hands, her eyes searching for a lie. "Kill him?" Winona asked. "They are moving him," Clara explained, her voice raspy. "They say he will try to escape. It is a trap. If we do not stop them, he will never reach the prison." The elders gathered. The warriors checked their weapons. There was a desire for war in their eyes, a desire to ride into town and burn it to the ground. "No," Clara said, standing in the center of the circle. "If you attack the town, they will kill him in the cell, and the army will send 1,000 men to wipe you out. We must be smarter. We must use the land." She drew a map in the dirt with a stick. "They will take the north road," she said. "It is the only way to the territorial capital. 3 miles out, the road cuts through Blackstone Ravine. It is narrow. The walls are steep. I know this place," Red Hawk said, nodding. "It is a choke point. We ambush them there," Clara said, "but not to kill. If we kill the soldiers, Chaska is a dead man anyway. He will be a fugitive forever. We must stop them without a massacre. We must make them give him up." It was a dangerous, fragile plan. It relied on timing, on the wind, and on the arrogance of Lieutenant Hayes. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the rocks in shades of blood and iron, the Lakota warriors began to prepare. They gathered sage and damp brush. They checked the cinches on their ponies, and Clara, the schoolteacher from Ohio, checked the load in the revolver she had taken from her husband's trunk. The dawn broke bitterly cold. It was one of those strange summer anomalies of the high plains, where the wind shifted from the north and brought the memory of winter with it. The sky was a hard, pale blue, polished like glass. Lieutenant Hayes rode at the head of the small column. He wore his dress uniform coat, buttoned to the chin, his breath misting in the air. Behind him rode 2 privates, looking miserable and cold, and between them, tied to a mule, sat Chaska. He was chained hand and foot. His face was bruised, his eyes sunken from days of little food and no sleep. He sat slumped in the saddle, but his eyes were alert, scanning the horizon. He knew what this ride was. He watched Hayes's back, waiting for the moment the lieutenant would draw his pistol. They reached the entrance to Blackstone Ravine. The walls of the canyon rose up 50 feet on either side, blocking out the morning sun. The trail narrowed to a single track, littered with fallen rock. "This is a bad spot, sir," one of the privates muttered, looking up at the cliffs. "Quiet. Jenkins," Hayes snapped. "There is not an Indian within 50 miles. Riggs' boys chased them halfway to Canada. They rode in." The sound of the horses' hooves echoed off the stone walls, loud and clattering. The wind funneled down the canyon, moaning like a dying thing. Chaska felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He looked at the rim of the canyon. A pebble skittered down the rock face. Suddenly, the sky fell on them. It was not rocks, and it was not bullets. It was smoke, bundles of damp. Burning sage and brush were thrown from the cliffs, landing on the trail in front of and behind the column. They burst into thick, choking clouds of white and gray smoke, instantly blinding the horses. The animals panicked. Hayes's horse reared, screaming. The mule Chaska was tied to bucked, throwing him violently to the hard ground. "Contact!" Hayes screamed, drawing his revolver. "Fire at will!" But there was nothing to shoot. The canyon was a swirling milk bottle of smoke. Then came the thunder of hooves. Lakota riders burst out of the smoke, not from the cliffs, but from the hidden crevices where they had waited. They did not fire. They screamed, war cries that curdled the blood, and swung heavy clubs at the soldiers' rifles, knocking them from their hands. In the chaos, Red Hawk leaped from his pony. He carried a heavy hammer and a chisel he had stolen from the railroad camp. He sprinted to where Chaska lay in the dirt, winded and bruised. "Red Hawk!" Chaska gasped. "Hold still!" Red Hawk placed the chisel against the chain connecting Chaska's ankles and struck it with a mighty blow. Sparks flew. The metal groaned but held. He struck again. The link shattered. Chaska scrambled up, his hands still manacled. The smoke swirled, momentarily clearing near the center of the trail. Hayes had regained control of his horse. He saw Chaska standing free of the mule. He saw Red Hawk, and he saw a figure on a mare, wrapped in a black duster, holding a gun. Clara. The realization twisted Hayes's face into a rictus of pure hate. "You!" he screamed. "You traitorous witch!" He raised his revolver. He did not aim at Chaska. He aimed at Clara. "No!" Red Hawk lunged at the lieutenant's horse, trying to grab the bridle. Hayes fired. The shot cracked like a whip. Red Hawk spun around, clutching his shoulder. Blood spraying onto the rocks. He fell hard. Hayes turned the gun back toward Clara. She sat frozen on her mare, her eyes wide. She had come to save them, and now she was looking down the barrel of death. Time seemed to slow. Chaska saw the hammer of the Colt pull back. He saw the tightening of Hayes's finger on the trigger. He saw Clara's face, pale and beautiful and terrified. He did not think. He launched himself, with a roar that came from the bottom of his soul. Chaska threw himself at Hayes. He hit the lieutenant just as the gun went off. The bullet went wild, chipping the stone wall inches from Clara's head. Chaska and Hayes crashed to the ground in a tangle of limbs. The lieutenant was heavy, but Chaska fought with the strength of a man who had nothing left to lose. He smashed his manacled wrists into Hayes's face. Hayes grunted, blood gushing from his nose, but he held on to the gun. They rolled in the dirt, dust and smoke choking them. Hayes brought his knee up, slamming it into Chaska's ribs. Chaska gasped, his grip loosening. Hayes shoved him back and scrambled to his knees, raising the gun for a point-blank shot. "Die, you dog!" Hayes shrieked. Chaska kicked out, his boot catching Hayes's wrist. The gun flew from his hand, skittering across the rocks. Hayes dove for it. Chaska lunged after him. They grappled for the weapon on the uneven ground. Hayes got his hand on the grip. Chaska grabbed the barrel, the hot metal searing his palm. They wrestled, face to face, eyes locked. Hayes's eyes were filled with madness. Chaska's were filled with a cold, hard resolve. I will kill you all, Hayes spat. I will burn every... He wrenched the gun, trying to twist it out of Chaska's grip. The movement was violent and jerky. The hammer, which had been cocked during the struggle, snagged on a button of Hayes's coat. The gun roared. It was a muffled, dull sound, pressed between their bodies. Hayes went rigid. His eyes went wide, the pupils blowing out until they swallowed the iris. He gasped, a wet, bubbling sound. Chaska felt the vibration of the shot travel through the metal and into his own bones. He let go of the gun. Hayes slumped backward, his hand falling away from the weapon. A dark stain spread rapidly across the blue wool of his stomach. The bullet had struck a rock beneath them, ricocheted at a cruel angle, and driven itself up into his body. The canyon went silent. The smoke drifted away on the wind, revealing the scene. Red Hawk lay groaning near the canyon wall, Winona tending to him. The two private soldiers sat on their horses, their hands raised, surrounded by 6 Lakota warriors with drawn bows. Clara had dismounted and was running toward Chaska. Hayes lay on his back, staring up at the strip of blue sky. His breathing was shallow and ragged. Chaska stood up, swaying. He looked down at the man who had tried to destroy him. There was no triumph in his heart, only a profound, exhausting weariness. Clara reached him, grabbing his arms, checking him for wounds. "Are you hit?" she cried, her hands frantic. "No," Chaska said. "I am whole." He looked at the soldiers. Jenkins was one of them. The boy was shaking so hard his saddle leather creaked. "Don't kill us," Jenkins whispered. "Please." Chaska walked over to them. He picked up Hayes's revolver from the dust. He checked the cylinder, then tucked it into his belt. "We are not murderers," Chaska said. His voice was steady, echoing off the canyon walls. He pointed to Hayes. "He is not dead, but he will be soon if he does not get a surgeon." Chaska looked at Jenkins. "Load him up," he ordered. "Take him back to the fort." Jenkins blinked, confused. "You're letting us go?" Chaska stepped closer, placing a hand on the horse's neck. "You will go back, and you will tell Colonel Bragg exactly what happened here. You will tell him that Hayes fired first. You will tell him that we defended ourselves. You will tell him the truth about the cattle and the fire." Jenkins nodded frantically. "I will. I swear it. If you lie," Chaska said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "the land will know, and you will never be safe in it again." The soldiers dismounted. They lifted the groaning, semi-conscious lieutenant onto his horse. They tied him securely. They looked at the Lakota warriors, expecting an arrow in the back, but the warriors stood like statues, bows lowered. "Go," Chaska said. The soldiers turned their horses and fled, riding back toward Iron Creek as if the devil were snapping at their heels. Chaska watched them go until the dust settled. Then he turned to Clara. She was standing amidst the rocks, her hat hanging down her back, her hair wild. She looked fierce and beautiful and utterly unbreakable. He walked to her. He took her face in his hands, wiping a smudge of soot from her cheek with his thumb. "It is done," he said. Clara closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. "Is it? Will they come back?" "Hayes is broken," Chaska said. "Even if he lives, his career is dead. The colonel will not want a scandal. He will bury this." He looked around at his family, at the warriors who had ridden for him. "We are free, Clara, but we are homeless." Clara opened her eyes. She took his hand, pressing it against her heart. "No," she said, "wherever we are, that is home." The aftermath was quiet, as tragedies often are when the shouting stops. Lieutenant Hayes survived the ride back to the fort, but the infection took his leg 3 days later, and the shame took his commission. He was sent back east, a bitter, crippled man who would tell stories of savage ambushes to anyone who would listen, but who would never wear a uniform again. Private Jenkins kept his word. He told the colonel everything. Bragg, terrified of a War Department inquiry that would expose his lack of control, chose the path of least resistance. He declared that the evidence against Chaska was insufficient, and that the lieutenant had acted outside the scope of his orders. The charges were quietly dropped. Amos Rigg blustered and threatened, but without Hayes to back him. and with the town whispering about planted evidence, his influence waned. He remained rich, and he remained hateful. But his power to command the army was broken. But it was not a complete victory. The town of Iron Creek did not suddenly open its arms. When Clara rode back into town to pack her belongings, the silence was deafening. Mrs. Gable crossed the street to avoid her. The Reverend locked the church doors when she passed. She was a pariah, a woman who had chosen the other. Clara did not care. She packed her books, her clothes, and her few treasures into a wagon. She left the key to the schoolhouse on the desk where she had taught so many children to read. She walked out without looking back. They found a piece of land in the gray zone, a strip of creek bottom that lay between the edge of the reservation and the open range. It was not the best land. It was rocky and prone to flooding, but it was theirs. Chaska and his cousins built the cabin. It was rough, made of cottonwood logs and chinked with mud, but it was solid. They built a corral for the horses. They planted a garden, late in the autumn, when the geese were flying south in great V formations. They married. It was a strange gathering. Reverend Phillips, a Methodist circuit rider who Clara had nursed through pneumonia 2 years prior, agreed to perform the ceremony. He stood under the spreading branches of an oak tree, his Bible open. On one side stood Chaska's family, Winona, Red Hawk with his arm in a sling, and the elders. They wore their best buckskins, adorned with quill work and beads. On the other side stood a handful of settlers, Mr. Henderson from the general store, Private Jenkins, who came in civilian clothes, and a few of the mothers whose children Clara had saved. They were 2 small islands of people, separated by a sea of history, bridging the gap for the sake of 2 souls. "Do you, Clara Hayes? Take this man." "I do," Clara said, her voice clear and strong. "Do you, Chaska, take this woman?" "I do," Chaska said, looking at her as if she were the only source of light in the world. The Reverend closed the book. The Lakota elder stepped forward. He wrapped a heavy buffalo robe around both of them, binding them together in the warmth of the hide. He spoke a blessing in the old tongue, calling on the spirits of the earth and the sky to watch over this union that defied the laws of men. That night, the wind howled around the new cabin, testing the walls. It rattled the door and whistled down the chimney. But inside, the fire was warm. There were no bars. There were no guards. There was no clock ticking down to a hanging. Chaska bolted the door. He turned to Clara, who was standing by the hearth, untying the ribbons of her dress. She looked at him, the shyness of the jail cell, the desperation of the ambush. It was all gone. In its place was a quiet, profound certainty. She came to him. She placed her hands on his chest, feeling the beat of his heart, a rhythm she had fought for, bled for, and won. "Chaska," she whispered. He did not speak. He lifted her into his arms, carrying her to the bed piled high with furs and quilts. He laid her down as if she were made of glass. But when he lay beside her, his touch was that of a man claiming his life. They surrendered to each other. It was a shedding of armor. Every kiss was a reclamation of the years they had spent alone. Every touch was a defiance of the world that said they should not exist. The passion was there, hot and demanding. But beneath it ran a river of tenderness so deep it made Clara weep. He held her hips, his hands firm and possessing, his skin dark against hers. She arched into him, whispering his name, anchoring him to the earth. They moved together in the firelight, 2 halves of a broken world finally made whole. In the quiet afterwards, the fire burned down to embers. They lay tangled under the worn blankets, limbs heavy with exhaustion and peace. Chaska stroked Clara's hair, his eyes watching the shadows dance on the ceiling. "We will have a hard life," he said softly. "The town will not forgive us. The winter will be cold." "We have weathered storms before," Clara said, resting her head on his shoulder. "We will teach." "Teach?" Chaska asked. "I will teach the children," Clara said. "Not just the white children, all of them. Anyone who wants to learn. We will build a school here, a place where they can learn to read and to track. a place where they don't have to choose between two worlds. Chaska smiled in the dark. It is a good dream, and we will plant trees, Clara added. Cottonwoods and apple trees. It will take years, but they will grow. They will have deep roots, like us. Maybe, Chaska said, his hand resting on her stomach. Maybe we will raise a child, one who knows that the land belongs to everyone and no one. Maybe, Clara whispered. They slept then, the sleep of the just and the saved. The final image of their story is not one of battle or courtrooms. It is a quiet morning in early winter. The sun is just cresting the eastern ridge, turning the frosted grass into a field of diamonds. The air is so cold it hurts to breathe, crisp and clean. Clara and Chaska stand outside their cabin, wrapped in their coats, their breath misting in the air. Chaska's arm is around Clara's shoulders. Her arm is around his waist. They are watching the valley below. A herd of wild horses is moving across the plain. They are dark shapes against the white frost, moving like a ribbon of smoke. They are free. They answer to no bridle, no fence, no master. Clara leans her head against Chaska's shoulder. He tightens his grip on her. The world out there is still cruel. The soldiers are still in the fort. The politicians in Washington are still drawing lines on maps they have never seen. The prejudice is still a rot in the heart of the territory. But here, on this small, hard-won scrap of earth, they stand together. Their love is not a fairy tale. It is something stronger. It is a stubborn, living defiance. It is a fire that the wind cannot blow out. They watch the horses vanish into the distance. And then, together, they turn back toward the warmth of their home. Thank you for listening to this story of Clara and Chaska. It has been a journey through the dust, the snow, and the fire of the American West, exploring a love that dared to exist in a world divided. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Please leave a comment below sharing your location and your thoughts on the story. Did Clara and Chaska's journey resonate with you? If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories of the frontier, the history, and the people who shaped this rugged landscape. Share your thoughts in English. I read every comment and value your perspective. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon.